Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to untold history of medieval Scotland Celts, Picts, Vikings and Kings. Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps, and share in the comments where you're joining us from and the hour there. Now, lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history. Before there were crowns or carved thrones, before citadels climbed the basalt, there was a country without castles and without a name, stitched by blood, memory, and weather. Picture it: green ridges broken by dark spruce, mist lifting off peat, the curl of a river, and a roundhouse crouched against the wind. Long before medieval Scotland, this was Alba in the cradle, a land of tribes taking their bearings from kin and hill, from cattle, salmon, and the season's mercy. Identity lived close to the skin. It wasn't a banner, but a bond. Society gathered itself around the clan larger than a household, smaller than a kingdom woven from fosterage and marriage ties, obligation and old feuds. Betrayal was almost unthinkable, not because people were saints, but because survival depended on trust. Your shield belonged to the people who would stand at your shoulder when raiders came. Your welcome at a distant hearth was another kind of armor. Celts' names a patchwork rather than a single people. Across the north, different tongues braided and parted a northern speech we call Pictish. Goidelic Gaelic along Atlantic inlets, older Brittonic voices in southern riverlands. They wore fine metalwork torques bright at the throat, brooches pinning checked cloaks, and counted wealth in cattle, grain, and oath-bound allies rather than in coin. Homes were practical answers to weather-ringed roundhouses of timber and turf, Brock towers shouldering up like beehives of a stone, Cranog's lake islands ribbed with oak piles where water itself became a wall. Hilltop forts watched paths between valleys, and below them narrow fields were scratched by wooden ards into ridges for bare barley and oats. People moved herds with the seasons, fished herring runs, and stored cheese for the hungry months. Religion was not a separate room, it was the house itself. Groves and rivers carried presents. Stones stood upright in the grass, faces carved with spirals and beasts. Later, Ogham lines nicked their edges with names the wind still mouths. The keepers of words, bards, and filled were law as much as song, remembering debts, boundaries, and genealogies. The summer fires of Beltane and the winter hush of Samhain kept the year's rhythm. This was not a gentle Eden. Tribes fought because hunger was near and honor nearer. A ridge of grazing rights was reason enough for a raid. An unpaid bride gift could crack a peace. But when larger danger loomed, old quarrels could be folded away. The habit of independence sat beside the habit of defense. That double thread, fierce self-rule and fierce protection of the land, twined into something that would endure even when names changed and kings appeared. Warriors painted themselves for terror and belonging, shields on the arm, light spears balanced in the hand, ash boughs strung with gut. They read ground like script, the quaking bog to swallow a pursuer, the narrow neck between locks to close like a fist. They used speed and disappearance, sudden blows and careful retreats. Later chroniclers sketched savages at the empire's edge. The truth is simpler, practical people solving hard problems with the tools at hand. The sea tied them outward as much as hills held them in. Western waters were a road. A hide boat, stitched tight with fat, could cross to Antrim on a fair tide. A curragh could island hop to the Hebrides. Long before any royal charter made a burgh, there was a market wherever two paths met, and trust could be borrowed, salt for wool, grain for beads. Law lived as memory. There were no shelves of books, only minds trained to recite what elders had decided last time. If boundary stones shifted in snow, people gathered and a poem might settle it. If you wronged a cousin, you paid in cattle or the feud would bloom. Mercy and revenge were rungs on a ladder climbed to keep the peace when parchment was rare and signatures were spoken. Across centuries, you can still hear the cadence that began here, stories binding strangers, land shaping loyalty. Later writers would introduce Picts and the Scots as if they were actors stepping onto an empty stage. The stage was never empty. These older clans had already set the props, the stones, the paths, the habits of alliance and enmity. When new faiths came by boat with books, the frames did not vanish. The tales learned new saints' names and kept walking. Listen at the edge of a peat bog at dusk, and you can imagine a name taking shape. Alba was not yet a kingdom. It was a sense of place, of kin, of obligation. The word once meant the whole island, but here it was shrinking and brightening to mean this north, this weave of loch and mountain and firth. People who had never met imagined each other correctly, tough hands, smoke in the hair, respect for memory, caution toward boast. Yet the horizon was never as still. Strange sails had been sighted before, traders with different weights on their scales, travelers with new prayers, but now, far to the south, larger shapes were assembling. An empire was measuring the island, counting days by marches, drawing lines that would harden into stone and ditch and mile castle. None of that is here yet. For the moment, consider only the silence before a drum begins. So we begin not with a coronation, but with a kitchen grain warming in a clay pot, children plucking at a harp's single surviving string, a grandmother correcting a genealogy for the 5th time. Outside, a boy runs the ridge to check the herd. He pauses at a standing stone and fits his palm to a notch where his grandfather's thumb once rested. He knows the land accepts him because his people keep its names. Tomorrow, the elders will say where to drive the cattle when the first frost sparks. Remember this atmosphere when later chapters arrive, crowded with kings and sieges, bishops and banners. It explains why warriors could vanish into hills a foreign army read as blank, why alliances were local, personal, and sticky, why a stone blessed by an ancestor could carry more authority than a distant court's scroll. In the hush before the frontier hardens, listen for the first heartbeat of a kingdom that does not yet call itself one. Footsteps are coming from the south, iron-shod and tireless, with surveyors' rods and engineers' tools, with gods in pocket shrines and pay chests stamped with an emperor's seal. They will halt at last and build a wall against the wind, and call the north beyond it wild. The wall will be a marvel. Untamed will become a kind of praise, but that is for our next watch in the night. For now, the fire sinks, the harp string hums, and Alba, still nameless, still many, draws its cloak tight against the dark. At last the drum begins. Footfall, ordered and unending, rolls up from the south. Surveyors pace with cords and rods. Picks bite the sod, and the first squared stones are placed with a certainty that looks like destiny. Year 122 by the count of the empire. The Emperor Hadrian has crossed the narrow sea to look at a difficult edge and decided, with an engineer's neatness, to draw a line across a whole island, 73 miles in our measure, 80 in theirs, running from the Solway Firth in the west to the Tyne in the east, a vertebrate spine of a stone backed by ditch, rampart, and road. You can feel the confidence shaping it if conquest bleeds the legions. Containment will husband them. If the north will not be tamed, it will be measured, taxed where possible, and warned away where not. The wall is not merely a barrier, it is a working town stretched thin. Mile castles punctuate its length like beads, each with a gate to the lands beyond and a little garrison tucked inside. Between them, the smaller turrets serve as eyes. Behind the wall runs the military road, and, farther south, the vallum, a deep, broad ditch with mounded banks marking the rearward boundary of the military zone. Forts anchor the line at intervals. Housesteads crisp on its ridge, Birdoswald watching the river's bend, Vindolanda, a little older and slightly to the south, a cluster of timber barracks and clay tablets on which the ordinary life of soldiers, birthdays, shoe sizes, the grousing of cold men has accidentally survived. Listen to the languages rippling along the parapet at change of watch. Latin gives orders, Iberian and Batavian jokes follow. A Syrian cavalryman adjusts his horse's tack and mutters a prayer to a god of the desert whose altar stands, incongruous and sincere, in the wet light of Northumbria. The army moves people as well as borders. Units raised on the Rhine find themselves learning reign on the Tyne. Archers, whose grandfathers saw the Euphrates pluck bowstrings in a wind that smells of peat and sheep. In the Vicus, the civilian settlement that huddles against the fort's walls, merchants learn the names of northern cheeses and sell olive oil in amphorae too precious to break. There are taverns, shrines to Mithras carved and candlelit, potter's kilns, the perpetual trade of favors and bread. The frontier is an argument, yes, but also a market. Stand on the rampart and look north. The land does not care about empires. Ridges lope away into mist, bogs shiver like breath, dark lines of forest stitch the horizon. Somewhere out there, in glens the legions will never name correctly, live the communities the Romans grouped as Caledonians, the painted ones, later Picts to other southern tongues. They are not an undifferentiated mass, any more than the men on the wall are only Romans. They are farmers who drive cattle through birch to summer pasture, smiths who know iron's moods, women who own the memory of boundaries older than any charter, and warriors who understand that this vast stone thing is also vulnerable, because everything made by human hands must be supplied, guarded, repaired. Raids crackle against the wall like sleet against a window. Fast-moving bands slip through gaps or swim where the river runs black and quiet under a moon, and lift cattle from the southern farms before vanishing into the folded ground. The answer is patrols, fortified bridges, punishment marches. Diplomacy goes with the spear gifts to this chieftain. Hostages from that one, permission for controlled market days beyond the gate. where wool and hides pass south and glass beads go north. The wall is a statement thus far and no farther, but statements always include fine print. For a while, the empire's ambition expands. Under Antoninus Pius, a fresh line is cut on the narrower waist of the island between Forth and Clyde, a turf rampart on a stone base running about 37 miles. The Antonine Wall, it is a forward step closer to the rain-swept heart of the north, guarded by forts with little sculpted distant slabs bragging of each legion's work. But it bites off more than supply can chew. The ground is wet, the distance is long, the resistance elastic. After 2 decades, the army draws back like a tide to Hadrian's stronger stones. Lines, it turns out, are not just built, they are rehearsed until the one that can be lived with remains. News from farther south filters to the ramparts with each relief column. A great victory long ago at a place Agricola's son-in-law called Mons Graupius. The emperor Septimius Severus, coming north in age and fury and withdrawing again in weariness, mutinies in the Rhineland, the empire's troubles in far-off deserts. The wall hardens its habits. Children are born in the Vici, learn to read the names on altars, and grow up to sell beer to men who will never see the Mediterranean. A centurion retires, buys a farm, and stays. Another is rotated to a posting where the sun has a different smell and remembers the north with a wry love he cannot explain. Not all contact is war. Frontier fashion changes, a brooch goes north on a soldier's sweetheart. A spiral motif comes south on a trader's cloak. A Pictish carver sees a Roman horse on a tomb, and later horses on Pictish symbol stones step with a new, learned grace. In some seasons, the gates are busy with exchange. In others, they are nailed shut and watchfires burn all night. The border is a living thing, contracting and expanding, cracking and healing, always stitched by human need. Still, the line fails often enough to confirm a legend the North refuses to be parceled. In the 4th century, a storm the Romans would later call the Great Conspiracy rakes the island Picts and other northern Confederates probing hard while troops are called away to other emergencies. The wall holds where it can, but the message is old and clear. An empire has limits. Its maps are ambitions drawn over a stubborn ground. Eventually, the pay chests grow lighter, and the soldiers who once took their orders from emperors now consult their stomachs and their neighbors. Garrison by garrison, the system thins. In the early 5th century, the formal Roman presence withers like frost under sun. What remains, the ditch and a stone, yes, half plundered for later barns and churches, but also the memory of opposition. To live north of the line is to have been defined as beyond by the most meticulous definers the old world produced, and to survive it, that becomes its own kind of fuel. Later poets will make pride from it. Untamed becomes a word people north of the wall learn to own without apology. Walk the surviving stretches today when cloud shadows run like hounds across the fells, and you can hear 3 kinds of silence, the quiet of moor and lark and grazing sheep. The imagined hush after a patrol's footsteps pass into distance, and the deeper pause of a people who looked at a wall and decided not to be contained by it. The Romans did not write Pict on their maps intending compliment, but the painted ones took the insult and made of it a legend, a self that outlasted the empire's ink. Behind the engineering lies a softer story. The tablets at Vindolanda, those flimsy leaves of wood, rescued by wet soil from ordinary oblivion, give us a birthday invitation, a request for socks and sandals, a soldier asking after his boys. Even at the edge of empire, the human scale persists. And because it persists, exchange persists. A frontier is never pure. That is its secret, and it's a strength. The wall failed to seal the world. It succeeded, accidentally, in mixing it. The Roman gaze called the people beyond barbarity, outsiders who babbled. The word says more about the listener than the speaker. Far to the west, Gaelic would grow and carry prayers across sea roads the legions never walked. In the heathered interior, Pictish symbols would be incised on stones whose meanings scholars still argue over. Proofs that the North was thinking in its own grammar. And from Ireland's northeast coast, later, ships would lift their prows and carry settlers who would call themselves Scotty Raiders at first, then planters of kin building a foothold in Argyll that would, after long centuries, help give the whole land its later name. For now, hold the picture steady a wall like a question, an answer made of patience, hills, and the habit of refusing easy names. The empire has brought roads, coins, glass, and the discipline of legions. The North replies with speed, weather, and memory. No one has won. History rarely grants that luxury. Instead, it keeps a ledger of influence religion, ready to travel by boat and blessing, a style of fort ready to be rebuilt in a stone on a Scottish rock, a habit of alliance hardened by pressure. When the legions go, the line they drew remains, and so does the pride in having stood beyond it. Night comes early on the ridge. In a little shrine cut from turf and a stone, a flame gutters before an imported god, and the centurion's shadow lengthens. Beyond the gate, on the damp grass, a set of tracks appears and then disappears into heather. The wall does what it can, which is all human things can do. It holds for a while. In the dark north, people plan their winter, count their cattle, polish the iron edges of spearheads, and tell stories of an empire whose stones shine like ice, but melt like it too when the weather changes. Soon we will walk away from the parapet, leaving Rome's breath behind, and step into that north to meet the painted ones and the seaborne neighbors who will share, contest, and finally combine a kingdom into being. Imagine living where the light from the North Sea comes cold and clean over fields stubbled with heather, and your nearest neighbors do not quite speak your tongue. To the east and north, the Picts, so named by outsiders who saw skin marked in blue and assumed that paint was identity, hold hilltops and river mouths with timber-laced ramparts. Their stones carry quiet in them, slabs set upright in churchyards and on old trackways, incised with symbols, a crescent and V-rod, a double disc, a proud beast whose long nose and curled tail have kept scholars arguing for centuries. To the west and over the wetback roads of sea, the Scots come in the skin boats and plank-built craft from Dal Riata, the Irish shore at their backs and the long Hebridean chain ahead. They bring a Gaelic that tastes of salt air, a memory of kingship bound to kin, and a way of thinking in archipelagos rather than fields islands as a steppes, channels as a streets, the Minch and the sound of Iona as familiar as lanes in a town. For a long time, These two peoples regard one another like deer at opposite tree lines, alert, curious, unwilling to commit. The Pictish kingdoms are many, and braided Orkney and Caithness looking north, Fortrio and Shirkin facing the Grampians and the fertile coastlands. Their rule may pass sometimes through the mother's line, or so later chroniclers insist, though nothing in the early record sits still for long. What endures is the sense of a confederation kept by oath and prestige, a lattice rather than a rod. The Scots of Argyll cluster round Dunad, a rock that rises like a ship from the bog. There a footprint is carved into the summit stone, and a king-elect stands in it to marry the land, a rite older than charters and signatures. From there, the sea roads radiate Gura, Islay, Tiree, Skye, each a bead on a string you can cross with a day's good wind and a practiced crew. When they meet, it is with gifts and swords. Raids bite into shore farms, bride-taking and hostage-giving glue treaties made in the smoky halls. One spring, Pictish cattle are driven off while the men are in the fields. One winter, a Scot prince winters with a Pict king and learns the shape of the other's hunting grounds. Kin is made by hand as much as by blood. A Pict marries a Gaelic-speaking woman, and his sons grow up able to pray in 2 registers. A Scot noble takes service with a Pictish lord and learns to read the symbols on gate posts as politely as he reads men's faces. There are years when the ridge between them flares and foams into battle, and other years when those same bridges are used as common landmarks meet by the standing stone with the salmon and the double disc. Someone says, and both sides know which stone is meant. The land works on both alike. In the east, the good soils ask for plows and patient sowings. In the west, cattle walk as wealth does, on cloven hooves over rough pasture, and the people keep flexible. The Pictish court carvers give their noble dead elegant horses that trot forever in a stone. The Scots praise oarsmen and helmsmen who know when the sound will turn against them. Both remember old gods with a wary respect, even as a newer faith, coming by boat and blessing, begins to thread itself through their speech. That new faith will matter soon, but for now it is enough to say that both peoples are porous. They learn, they adapt, they keep the forms that work. We, who come later and want our stories clean, sometimes try to draw lines where lives refuse them. Were the Picts painted sometimes? Did they inherit only through women sometimes? And sometimes through the strongest sword arm? Were the Scots simply Irish? In one sense, yes, a colony of kin across a narrow sea. In another sense, no settlers who made a place until the place remade them. In both camps, law is memory and memory is law. The Gaelic Derb Fine counts degrees of kin. The Pictish assemblies judged trespass and blood price by precedent kept in mouths, not on parchment. Chiefs sit on benches with warriors ranged behind, and disputes are ended with cattle, or iron, or a hand laid on the shoulder in front of witnesses who will not forget. There are figures we can name to steady the mist. A Pictish king in the north, Bride, son of Maelchon, receives emissaries and keeps a court at a hill fort that looks down on the river Ness. His men can be found farther south in seasons of pressure. A Scot king in Argyll, Iaddan MacGabrain, tests his strength eastward and southward and pays in blood when he guesses wrong. Their choices ripple outward. where one makes alliance with Britons of the Strathclyde lands, the other must make peace with a northern neighbor, lest two fronts open at once. The long view is not of a single march toward union, but of eddies that over time begin to spiral into a single channel. Then the sea darkens with new prows. The first Norse ships cut the farther isles like knives, and what began as hard raids quickly becomes settlement. Orkney and Shetland twist to the pull of Norway. The Outer Hebrides look both ways at once. A fresh grammar of power arrives, jarls who sit their longhouses with a different posture, runes pecked into stone alongside older Ogham, scratches and church crosses new carved from old belief. The Picts feel the hot wind of this change along their coasts and up their river mouths, and the Scots feel it in their sea lanes. Fires on promontories become common. Monasteries, useful places for books and cattle, become more careful about where they store both. Under pressure, difference matters less than survival. A Pictish war band fights beside a Gaelic-speaking retinue because both have enemies who wear iron rings on their arms and worship different gods. The Scots' habit of fast communication by boat and the Picts' command of inland routes become complementary skills. One brings news, the other brings men. Trinkets cross borders, bronze brooches with spiral arms, Norse beads, knives ground thin by loving use. Words cross too. A Pictish boy learns to say aslan for goodbye and does not forget the taste of it. A Scot girl learns to read a carved salmon as a sign you are passing into someone else's law, and learns to take her knife from her belt with deference at the next doorway. The deeper mixing the one that cannot be counted by marriage treaties and hostages happens in stories. A Pictish hunter who watches otters in the river teaches a Scot friend the name for the slick way their bodies ribbon through water. A Scot poet adds that word to a praise song for a Pictish chieftain, and no one blinks. A smith in a Pictish fort forges a ring-headed pin after the Gaelic fashion because his customer has married a woman from the Isles who misses home. A monastic scribe copies a Latin life of a saint and, in the margin, where no abbot looks, sketches a beast with a long nose and a playful tail as if to say, our old signs are still here. We like our turning points clean a banquet, a betrayal, a strong king, but the truth builds like frost, a layer at a time. By the 9th century, when the Viking storm is at its angriest and the island's center has learned every route by which raiders come and settlers stay, the long weaving of Pict and Scot has become a strong cloth. Gaelic is a language with a broader stride. The Pictish tongue, whether a daughter of Brittonic or something distinct, grows quiet in courts where decisions must be understood across valleys and sea sounds. The symbol stones do not stop being beautiful, but the names spoken before them change. The idea grows that there is a single Alba, a high name for a land that contains smaller names, and that the men who guard it can be one people without becoming the same. If there is a single place to stand and feel the slow hinge turn, it is perhaps at Scone, not yet the ceremonious place it will later be, but already a place where oaths taste older than men. Yet even here the moment is not explosion, but accretion. A Scot claimant can point to a Pictish mother. A Pictish chief can point to Gaelic allies who kept his cattle safe. Whatever cleverness or ruthlessness individual kings may apply, and they will the soil that makes union possible, has been prepared by centuries of living beside one another and occasionally inside one another's houses. So imagine the two tree lines drawing closer until the deer step out and feed in the same meadow. Hear the accents on that grass, a Pictish older man giving a proverb whose rhythm is ancient, a Scot woman answering in Gaelic with a rhyme that matches it. Somewhere a boat builder from Islay explains to a Pictish carpenter why this curve of plank takes the wave better. Somewhere a Pictish mason shows a Scot why this batter of wall resists the frost. They argue, laugh, trade, and bury their dead in churchyards where the old symbols and the new crosses share space without jealousy. They do not know what we will call them, only that the pressure from the sea and from the south is real, and that together they stand a steadier. Soon enough, a name Kenneth will be set like a pin through these threads, and later chroniclers will pretend the cloth was woven in a single afternoon of cleverness and blood. Before we walk to that chapter, let us hold a longer image. Two peoples, one coastline, one weather, one a stubborn habit of survival, slowly learning that the best way to keep their stories is to braid them. Out of that braid, a kingdom will find its voice. The sea does most of the talking as a small leather boat noses through the sound. Wind breathes from the west, salt clings to lips, and the low green island lifts from the water like a smoothed stone in a palm. Iona, it is the year 563 by later counting, and a tall monk with a soldier's gait and a poet's eyes steps ashore with a few books wrapped against the spray, a bell, and 12 companions. He has left Ireland after quarrels that grew too sharp. Whether exile, penance, or calling, only the heart knows. He builds with driftwood and turf, then with oak and wattle, a settlement simple as prayer cells that rustle in the wind, a chapel that smells of damp wool and beeswax, a hearth where ink warms and vellum dries. Columba has come to the edge of the world and found a center. Life here is spare and exact. The day rings itself out with the small bell he brought primes, tierce, sext, noontime arranged not by kings but by psalms. Monks scratch letters into calfskin until the black of the ink blooms with margined color. Hands learn the discipline of the line, the patience of the curve. A scribe prays with his pen, a carpenter with his adze, a fisherman with a wet rope coiled through his palm. In the evenings, someone tells a story, and the old stories do not die, but turn their faces toward a new light. One of those stories will be about a beast in a long river to the north, a creature seen and rebuked and made to flee. Another will be about a locked gate at a Pictish fortress that opens when a stranger refuses to be turned away. From the small outpost, ripples spread. Leather boats lift and settle like breath as the brothers cross to Mull, to Tiree, to Skye, then east along the firths to lands where carved stones show crescents and rods, deer-necked beasts and salmon with skillful fins. Columba goes himself along the great glen, the water a dark, patient seam toward the Moray coast, and stands before Brede, a Pictish king with flint in his gaze and honor in his bearing. Whether the gates open by miracle or courtesy, the effect is the same. The monk is heard. He speaks about a single God who makes weather and fate and forgiveness. He listens as men answer who have kept older pacts with grove and the stone and river. No one throws away the world that fed him, but some men learn to bless it with different words. Faith, in these early days, travels as quickly by kinship as by doctrine. A prince of Dal Riata receives a blessing and, with it, a binding to the island that keeps the books. A Pictish noble marries a woman from the Western Isles who can sing psalms and laments with equal ease. She fashions a cross from driftwood for the doorpost, while the old symbol stone remains in the field. The new undergirds the old without always displacing it. You can see the blend on shorelines where a stone crosses rise, where standing stones once kept their lonely watch. You can hear it where a psalm's cadence falls into step with a river name that has always had weight in the mouth. The workmanship of Iona is not only a prayer, it is also law, learning, and the steadying of kings. In Argyll, a king is still made by standing in a carved footprint on Dunad and facing a horizon of sea. But now a monk's hand rests on his shoulder and gives him a book to kiss and a promise to keep. In Pictish lands, assemblies still decide blood prices and trespasses by memory. But a cleric keeps a tablet near his heart and begins to write down what he is certain the elders will not wish to forget. Alongside this, there's mercy attempting to shoulder its way into war. A generation after Columba's death, one of his successors, Adominan, will carry a new law across the Isles and the mainland, the law of innocence, arguing that women, children, and clerics should be spared the knife when men settle their quarrels. The idea will not end raiding, but it will give language to those who wish to call a halt. Beyond the North Channel, alliances widen. A king of Northumbria, raised in the exile of Iona's hospitality, invites a monk from the island to preach among his people. A new house at Lindisfarne rises from Tidal Rock, and with it, a road of words and a skill crosses the borders of language. From this shared craft of prayer and design comes a style of art that seems to breathe interlaced beasts. Spirals like fern tips unfolding, a crucified figure serene at the heart of the storm. Some later will say that the greatest of these gospel books began on Iona's benches and found safety inland when the sea grew cruel. Whether that is so or not, the hands trained here teach other hands, and the lines of their teaching can be traced as surely as any road. Columba's island becomes a graveyard for kings as well as a school for clerics. Sailors learn to steer for the low abbey walls when a royal death has emptied a hall. A procession of boats moves quiet as thought along the Sound, carrying men who once wore torques and rings and now wear shrouds. A circle of stones rises in holy ground, and with it a memory that says, the isle holds the bones of rulers from Scotland, from Ireland, even from the far side of the Northern Sea. The authority of a place accrues in layers prayer, art, burial, counsel. Iona becomes a hinge in the way a clasp is a hinge, functional, modest, but holding the two sides of a cloak together in the wind. Yet the sea that carries monks and mourners will also carry ruin. Not long after the first longships trouble Lindisfarne, prows point toward Iona. The brothers keep watch from the dunes, and from a low knoll they use as a lighthouse of the soul. Fires ash the rafters. Blood spills among the rushes. A tally of the dead is kept in a clean hand in the margin of a psalter. Some scatter west to Kells with their books and their habits, an island house becoming a mainland refuge. Some stay, rebuild, and bless the charred timbers. The rhythm of raid and rebuilding becomes familiar, and with it, a new humility in the face of time. What the monks have made is portable letters, rules, a way of speaking to kings. They will carry it wherever they must. Within Pictish kingdoms, a debate over practice sharpens and then softens. How to cut a cleric's hair, when to keep Easter, these sound small to us, but they stand for which horizons a church will face. One Pictish king, hungry for order and Roman certainty, sends for builders from across the border to raise a stone in a continental manner and aligns his observances with those used by the greatest cities of Christendom. Another favors the island way and the old reckoning of the moon. The argument warms many hearths and shapes many sermons, and still, the deeper truth holds the faith on this soil, whether in the Ionan or the Roman rhythm, has begun to give the North a common tongue for mercy and for judgment. And what of Columba himself? He dies as he lived, at work and at prayer. In the small hours, leaning on a stone pillar by lamplight, he copies a psalm and feels his hand grow light. In the chapel, he kneels and breathes out his lost as the brothers chant what they chanted yesterday and will chant tomorrow. His biographer, a later abbot, writes down wonders as a net to keep the man from slipping out of sight. But beyond marvels, the shape of the legacy is practical, a mesh of houses stretched across sea and firth that can share news faster than an army can march, a habit of blessing rulers that disciplines them in public, a bookishness that remembers what blood feuds forget, a road between Pict and the Scot where once only suspicion moved. Stand for a moment on Iona's pebbled shore, where cowrie shells mingle with slate chips, and the water is bright even under a sky the color of pewter. Behind you, a low chapel hums with a sound like bees. Before you, Mull rises, dark and folded, and beyond it, the mainland, hung with weather. Somewhere inland, a carved stone shows a salmon under a crescent where men have met to judge a case. Somewhere else, a king faces the wind at Dunad, his foot in a footprint older than his name, while a cleric's hand rests gentle on his shoulder. The island has threaded them together. When the Picts and the Scots finally claim a single name for their combined home, this is part of what they will mean by it, not only land and law, but a soul taught to read, taught to forgive, taught to keep faith at the edge of the world. First comes the line on the horizon, too straight to be cloud, too quick to be mist, then the hiss of oars. By the time someone calls from the dunes, dragon heads are already cutting the surf, and wet shields are flashing like fish scales. A quiet morning in a northern cove becomes metal, breath, and shouting. This is how the story of the Northman enters Scotland suddenly, like weather. The first blows fall not far away, a tidal island of prayer and paint at the edge of Northumbria, where books slept in their cradles and bells called the gulls. Word of that sack crosses the firths faster than a courier can ride, and soon the same long, low ships knows for Iona, for the monasteries of the Hebrides, for any shore that keeps silver in a chest, and people who believe their walls are boundaries. The monks write the year beside the wound and rebuild with hands that smell of salt and soot. But the sea remembers the way. Raids are only the beginning. The Northmen are not just raiders. They are farmers with adventurous cattle, makers of rope and rivets, women who know how to bind a roof against winter. The same oars that brought fire bring families. In Orkney and Shetland, the settlements become a strings of houses tucked into the wind, fields laid out like a chessboard of oats and grazing. Assemblies are called at sites named for the thing, the meeting, where free men speak and decide, and these names cling to the land like sea spray. Dingwall in Shetland, Dingwall further south, places where law is voiced under open sky. A new order leans into the gale and holds. Language leaves its fossils. Along capes and promontories, Nies becomes a suffix as common as rain. Along bays, wick sits in the mouth like a pebble, smoothed by tide. On islands, a clipped A marks land ringed by water torn away. Sanday and far harbors take on kirk and vagger and turn, with times a soft tongue, into Kirkwall. A few words slip into daily use for boats, weather, and the clean business of the sea. In the Northern Isles, a Norse speech later called Norn will linger for centuries, a hearth sound that refuses to go out even when the wider world speaks Gaelic or Scots. In the West, the mingling runs the other way. Gaelic holds the ground, but its songs add an edge of salt and iron. Power reshapes itself to the water. The strongest men in these years are less kings of acres than kings of roots. They rule by current and tide, their domains laced together by crossings no land army can block. The Orkney earls jarls, in their own reckoning, keep a court as keen as a blade's edge. One of them, a Sigurd, with a wolf on his banner, will take his longship to Ireland and die on a Dublin meadow when 1,000 spears crash together at Clontarf. Another, Rognvald, by name, will be sung of by skalds for his courage in fjords and his gifts to poets. Their earldom is pledged to Norway, yet angled always toward Scotland and the Irish Sea, a hinge of loyalties as complicated as the tide charts folded in their chests. South and west, the Hebrides and the long blue road to Man are named in Norse mouths. The southern isles, Sudrijar, and ruled by men who are equally at home in a Gaelic hall and a Norse booth. They marry for sales as much as for love. Their children grow up with 2 languages in their ears and an instinctive understanding that a clan and a crew are only different kinds of kin. In time, a prince with a Norse name softened by Gaelic summerlit will rise from Argyll with a fleet like a moving forest and stitch together a sea kingdom that the land-bound rulers must reckon with. After him, lords known as of the Isles will sit in halls that smell of peat and tar, listening to harpers tune old stories to new horizons. The boats themselves are arguments. Longships, clinker-built, with overlapping planks, ride the chop like seals and slide up shingle in a rush. Broader-bellied gnar carry cargo barley, wool, iron, walrus ivory along the same routes, their timber keels and iron nails hammered out in smoky sheds, where a boy keeps bellows breathing are the hidden grammar of the age. A lord in Moray can put men on a headland with the speed that makes a castle seem slow. A monastery learns that a library must be portable texts, copied twice, chests ready, a boat kept in good repair in the sedges. Violence is no rumor. Iona suffers again and again. On one black day, the number of the slain is written by a careful hand in the margin of a psalm, the vellum wrinkled by salt and grief. Farther north, Brock's that had watched older storms now see sails like gull wings and hear a new set of war cries. Yet the iron truth under the ironwork is that raiding is a season, and seasons turn. What follows, as often as fire, is a settlement. A Pictish farmer finds himself working next to a man whose god was once a one-eyed wanderer and is now, since he married a woman who sings to Mary, a quiet, crucified Lord. The fence line is a conversation. The winter is shared. Evidence of this mingling remains where a sand keeps secrets. On Sand Day in Orkney, a burial is found long after the bones have forgotten their names, a boat's shadow in the earth, a man placed with weapons, a woman with her ornaments, a child with a smallness that catches the throat. On Lewis, a horde of carved figures, kings with crossed swords, grim bishops, rooks shaped like silent warders sleep in a sandbank until they are lifted into light. They speak of a trade webs that run north to Trondheim and beyond, and of the way a quiet Hebridean beach could open, if you knew how, onto a world of fur, silk, and silver. Norse law digs its roots deep in the islands. Land is held in a way the later Scots lawyers will call udal, alodial, answerable to no overlord except the law and the sea. In Shetland and Orkney, this tenure will persist long after the rest of Scotland has converted its land into feus and charters chained to a crown. The island parliament still meets under names that remember the old assemblies. The habit of speaking one's case in public and letting neighbors judge has a long memory here. The push of the Northmen does more than redraw coasts. It presses rival peoples toward one another until they begin to move as a single body. Scots in Dal Riata, those western shores and islands that look toward Ireland, feel the hammer on their strand and learn that their best harbor is the shelter made by alliance. To the east, Pictish kings look out from hill forts toward the glinting mouths of rivers and count the ships. Between them grows a sense hard to name at first that there is such a thing as the whole. The old boundary stories about us and them rearrange themselves into a new kind of way, born not of agreement, but of necessity. Not all contacts are hostile. Traders learn the taste of each other's ale. A smith in Caithness swaps a technique for a hinge pin or a way to harden an edge. A woman from a Norse farm in Bressay teaches her Gaelic neighbor to weave a pattern that sheds rain without shedding heat. Priests from island monasteries step into longboats when the wind is fair, and, by way of blessing a newborn, learn enough of names and laws to preach without giving offense. Later, when bishops with more continental habits visit the Northern Isles, they will find a Christianity already present simple, sea-worn, stubborn, and will set about smoothing its roughness without quite scraping away the grain. Beyond Scotland's sightlines, kings argue in halls lit by whale oil and rushes about who owns what water. A Norwegian ruler rides the swell with a fleet to remind islanders of their duties and finds, off the Ayrshire coast in a stormy year, that Scotland is not a shoreline to be idly tested. The Battle of Largs will lodge itself in memory, not for heaps of the dead, but for what followed a treaty that brings the Hebrides and Man into Scotland's keeping while leaving Orkney and Shetland still yoked to Norway. Even that tie will loosen later, pawned for a princess's dowry and never redeemed, a legal knot that will interest lawyers centuries on. What begins with terror settles into pattern. In the far north, a man may plow fields under a law older than the Stuarts. In the west, a lord may hold court with harpers while his galleys tug at their moorings, ready to move his will along the water. Place names, boat hooks, burial goods, and the stubborn endurance of stories all tell the same tale. The North did not come and go. It came and stayed, and in staying became part of Scotland's bone and breath. Stand again on the dune where the shout first went up. The beach is quiet now. Kelp hums in the wash. Far out, a cormorant draws a black line against pale water and then drops, clean as a needle, under the skin of the sea. Behind you, a village mends a net and a cradle. Ahead of you, the horizon is a thought with salt on it. From this pressure oar, keel, bow, Scotland learned to make its shape, and because of that pressure, men who once eyed one another across mountains will, in the next turn of our story, stand on the same rock and call their shared ground by a single name. By the time the last of the longship's wakes had flattened into ordinary tide, a different current was already running through the land, quiet, inland, and human. It moved along cattle tracks and over the shoulders of hills, along river fords and through halls where oaken benches shone with use. It was the steady pull toward one crown, not a single lightning stroke, but a knitting, a drawing together of peoples who had long watched one another warily from opposite banks of the same river. When we speak the name that tradition gives this turning Sinead MacAlpin, Kenneth MacAlpin, we are really speaking of a dozen forces with one face. The old Pictish kingdom, Fortriu, and its sister realms had already been hammered thin. A great Norse storm in the 830s spilled men and iron deep into the heartland. A single calamity, half buried in the chronicles but heavy in consequence, left kings and leading men dead in a tangle of spear shafts and sea-wet cloaks. That blow did not erase the Picts. It broke the habit of their certainty. After it, lines of succession that had once been intricate and stable began to slip, and rival claimants searched for shelter in new alliances. On the western side of the mountains, the Scots of Dalriata were no less threatened, their island churches blistered by fire, and their sea roads taxed by other men's oars. In this weather, the logic of two peoples stiffening together against a common wind ceased to be theory and became survival. Kenneth steps into this space, not as a sudden conjurer of unity, but as a man with the right braid of claims, patience, and timing. He is a Scot by tongue and father-son of Alpin, whose own death in the struggle against Picts and Norse would later be dressed in legend and possibly tied by maternal kin to Pictish royal lines in ways that made his presence in the North neither alien nor easily refused. Gaelic storytellers will remember his name as a seed that took root. Later writers, in love with a spectacle, will embroider a feast of a treachery at Iskone, where Pictish nobles were tricked to their doom. But the damp truth of politics is subtler compacts, marriages, the placing of friends in abbeys and fortresses, and the slow recognition that a man who can hold together the West and the East is, for the moment, a path rather than a wall. We see his hand most clearly not in a single battlefield, but in the furniture of a kingdom. The center of gravity shifts from perilous Iona to safer Dunkeld, where relics of St. Columba are translated inland, a holy migration that carries authority upriver the way a barge carries grain. A new inauguration habit coalesces at Ascone, on a low hill where law has long been spoken under the open sky. There, with bare earth underfoot and a block of ancient stone beneath him, destiny, some will later call it, weaving the rock into Jacob's ladder and oriental quarried myths, a king is lifted and set down amidst silence and shout. Whatever the stone's first story, in Scotland it becomes the place where a body learns the weight of a rule, and where a community rehearses the grammar of consent and command. The word Alba begins to appear like a watermark in charters and annals. First faint, then sure. This is not yet the Scotland of our maps. It is a smaller, tougher thing, a stitched together spine from the Tay to the Espay, its ribs reaching toward coasts where other banners still snap in the salt. The language of kingship in its courts is increasingly Gaelic. The old Pictish tongue does not vanish in a single generation, but it yields ground as fashion, church, and power carry the grammar of the West into the East. Carved stones remember Pictish symbols for a time after voices cease to use them. A people do not become somebody else just because their sons swear oaths in a different speech. Even so, the face of rule shifts, and with it, the stories men tell about who they are. Kenneth's reign, measured out in the thin entries of later chronicles, is not long, but it is dense. He tests the southern borders, worries at the old Northumbrian line, and tends his inner garden, placing kin and companions where they will best root the tree. When he dies, around the middle of the 9th century, the thing he has made is not finished and not secure. It is, however, real. That may be the most any founder can do, die and leave something that continues to be itself in other hands. Those hands are kin, Donald, Constantine, Aed, names that to later ears blur like a series of tides, yet each of them adds a stone. Some reigns are short and assaulted with blood, others quiet but fruitful. Under Constantine Dwam and his successors, the new realm learns the rhythm of campaigning seasons against Norse and English neighbors, learns also how to sit down in winter and make law that people will actually keep. Giric, a figure half lit by rumor, is remembered in some tellings as a patron of the church and the man who opened doors for bishops, a hint of how closely sanctity and sovereignty were braided. By the time Constantine II kneels at the Church of St. Andrews and, after a battering lifetime, lays his crown upon the altar, Alba is no longer a hopeful phrase. It is a house with rafters that will hold another roof. If we look closely at the fabric of this new house, we notice the weave kingship still follows the old island habit of tanistry, where succession runs through senior branches of a royal kindred, and cousins contend as often as sons. That produces both resilience and risk, a deep bench of able men, and an equally deep well of grudges. The court is peripatetic by necessity. There is power in the moving presence of a king who appears in Moray 1 month and at Ascone the next, hears cases, takes hostages, remits a tax, and accepts the hospitality that is part tribute, part insurance. Castles in the later sense are still rare, defensible sites, forts on river bends. Strongholds on volcanic plugs serve both as symbols and tools, while carpenters and masons slowly learn to imagine a stone as more than shrine and boundary. Against this, making presses the sea, Norse jarls in Orkney tipped their balance alternately toward Norway and toward the mainland, their oaths as practical as weather. In the west, descendants of sea kings exchange gifts with Gaelic lords and calculate, every season, whether to lean into a Scottish friendship or away from it. Alba is pulled like a mast in crosswinds. Its virtue in these years is that it bends without breaking and learns which ropes to strengthen. The church is the quiet engine. Monasteries become more than refuges. They are treasuries of legitimacy. A king who can patronize a house, endow a shrine, and be seen kneeling before a relic that has recently and safely crossed dangerous water is a king who knows how to translate danger into blessing. Hagiographers, those careful makers of saints' lives, find ways to tuck their patrons' names into miracle stories without shattering modesty. Bishops, some educated beyond the sea, bring back not only books, but habits of record keeping and a sense that Alba can think of itself as part of a larger Christian commonwealth, even as it insists on its own ways. In the telling of later centuries, the Picts disappear under Kenneth's sons, absorbed into Gaelic Scotland like salt into soup. That story is too neat. Peoples do not vanish, they change what they emphasize. Farmers still carve the same fields. Smiths temper blades with the same eye for color in the metal. Mothers still teach children the border between courage and folly. What does alter is the register in which public life is sung. Names on the stones turn from symbol to script. Laws that once traveled by memory are coaxed into writing. The men who stand at a scone to lift a king now speak one another's words without translation. That is how nations are made, not by erasure, but by the discipline of saying we so often that it becomes true. If you want a single image for this birth, picture a procession on a damp morning. Clerics with tonsured heads carry a reliquary from a boat drawn up on a shingle to a church, whose new timbers smell like honey. Behind them walk warriors with their hair tied back, some with Pictish beasts inked under their sleeves, some with Gaelic prayers knotted into leather. Behind them come the women who keep what is kept: lineage, recipe, lullaby. At the threshold, a man who will be king removes his shoes and steps onto the stone cold through his soles, older than any oath, and for a breath his face shows the full weight of the thing he is entering. The chant begins. Outside, a raven startles from the thatch and lifts. The weather holds. From here, Alba will be tested. There will be battles whose names will sound like hail on a slate roof, and councils where voices will fray to a hush. But the hinge has turned. What was once a patchwork of wary neighbors is now a garment that, if tugged by enemies, pulls tight rather than apart. You can still hear the creak of the new seams. You can also hear the confidence of cloth that will be worn, mended, and handed on. After Kenneth's death, the new thing he named did not stride forward like a war horse, it learned to walk. Alba was still a fresh seam, the stitches showing, the cloth pulled by many hands at once. If you could stand on a ridge above the Tay in those years and listen, you would hear the kingdom being made in ordinary sounds, hooves on wet track, as a king's train moved from settlement to settlement. The measured chant of clerics in timber churches, iron on iron in river ford skirmishes, and behind it all, the low weather of uncertainty that accompanies any beginning. The word Alba itself gathered weight. It had once meant simply the land, the island. Now it began to mean this land under these kings with these obligations. The men who wore the new title, Donald, Constantine, Aed, Giric, were not romantic founders, but maintenance workers of sovereignty. They kept the roof on. They did it in a world where danger did not queue politely at the door. From the north and east, Norse jarls sounded their horns across the firths. From the south, English kings weighed the frontier as an abacus, counting what could be drawn into their sums. Between these pressures, Alba learned the double craft of survival, to stand and to bend. Kingship, in these decades, was itinerant by design. A court that moved was a court felt. The king's presence judging disputes, renewing oaths, redistributing gifts was the grammar by which disparate peoples were taught to conjugate we. There were no stone palaces to hibernate in. The realm was a circuit of halls and hill forts, of moot hills, where law was spoken in air that smelled of peat and wet grass. The habit of succession remained tanistry, not a straight line from father to firstborn, but a braided cable through the senior branches of a royal kindred. It made sense in a landscape where every valley could rear a capable man, and it guaranteed, like weather, that storms would form. The Chronicle of the Kings of Alba records reigns in flinty sentences, and he ruled X years, but the silences between those lines are full of bargaining, cousinship, and the careful placing of loyalties. Religion thickened the mortar. Earlier, we watched St. Columba's light move from sea edge to heartland. In the 9th and 10th centuries, that light learned the shapes of inland sanctuaries. Relics were translated to Dunkeld. St. Andrew's grew in consequence, more than a fishing place, now a shrine that taught men how to kneel together. The reforming Célie des Servants of God left their neat footprints in the record, an austere reminder that prayer can be as political as any levy. Kings endowed churches as much for salvation as for administration. A bishopric or monastery anchored royal influence more gently than a garrison, but just as firmly. In a land where parchment was precious, a charter was a small miracle power pressed into ink. Meanwhile, the Pictish and Gaelic worlds continued their slow intermarriage. The old Pictish tongue did not fall silent all at once, but public life increasingly sang in Gaelic. Names shifted, symbols softened into letters, sculpted stones from earlier generations still stood in fields like elderly witnesses at a wedding, watching two families learn to share a table. The provincial lords More Myers, in later phrasing, held their districts like ribs around a torso, their fealties binding the center or straining it depending on who wore the crown. Under Constantine Bar and the shadowed figure of Giric, Alba learned the tempo of campaign and council. Under Constantine II, long-lived, watchful the kingdom put its shoulder against history's heavy door. This Constantine was a king who understood that a small realm survives by thinking beyond itself. When Athelstan in England sought to gather the island into his vision, Constantine did not simply bristle, he allied. In 937, at Brunanburh, he and his partners kings from the north and west, including the ruler of Strathclyde and a Norse Gaelic warlord from Dublin, met Athelstan's army in a battle that later poets would harden into national scripture. The old man of Alba fought and bled, And though Athelstan claimed victory, the contest itself made something plain. Alba belonged in the arithmetic of Britain. It could not be added without its own consent. When Constantine laid down his crown a few years later and retired to the church at St. Andrews, he did not leave a void so much as a shape to be filled. Abdication to a monastic life told his people that kingship and holiness were not opposite poles. It told his successors that the rule is service under God and under time. Kings came and went. Mael Coluim, Indolf, Dub, Quilen, Shinayet Macmail Coluim, names that, in a list, look like pebbles, but each pebble turned the river's run. Some reigns were short and violent, cut by ambush or treachery. Others were quieter, their work the patient tightening of threads fortifying a crossing, drawing a wavering lord back into the circle, making a marriage that prevented a feud from awakening. Law deepened. To speak of law here is to speak of something lived more than written. It was the memory of what had been judged before, the custom of the place, the expectation that a wrong would be righted in a manner that preserved tomorrow. Kings swore to uphold the rights and laws of the Britons, and the Scots phrases that, however formulaic, acknowledged the layered character of the realm. The inauguration at Scone, bare feet on earth, the old stone under the body. The shout of the people remained the civic drama in which everyone learned their part. A kingship rooted in the soil had to return to the soil to renew itself. And yet the unity was always thin ice over deep water. The North Moray, in particular, could act like a kingdom within the kingdom, its lords measuring themselves by mountain horizons rather than by the wool from a scone. The West kept its sea mind, the East watched the long shadow of the North Sea and of men who rode out of it. Norse power did not simply retreat when unfashionable, it mutated, becoming lordship in the Isles, jarldoms looking both to Norway and to the mainland, their oaths practical and their swords without a sentiment. Alba's strength was the willingness to bargain without surrender, taking hostages rather than tribute, marriages rather than massacres when it could, and force when it must. There were other, quieter signs of a kingdom maturing. Roads, by which we mean here not Roman stone and mortar, but dependable tracks, maintained by custom and obligation, began to matter. If a king could reach you reliably, the law could too. Ferries at certain fords, bridges at others, a rhythm of hospitality called cane and convith, food renders and billeting that both burdened and tied communities to their moving court. Coinage was rare and prestige-based. Wealth still grazed on four legs, but gift exchange, and with it the delicate economy of honor, kept the machine oiled. The castle stone, shouldering the sky, had not yet remade the map. Strongholds were earth and timber, or rock naturally defended, but the idea of fixed places signaling permanent rule was germinating. A stout fort above a river bend was a message as much as a redoubt: justice is here, and the king has been. When later masons taught Scotland to think in squared ashlar, they would be answering a need already felt in these earlier decades. If the chronicles are terse, the lived story was not. Picture Constantine II, white in the beard, looking over a council of lords whose fathers had once fought him. Picture a bishop untying a small packet whose contents, a finger bone, a splinter of timber, would steady the loyalties of a province. Picture a messenger riding hard from the Moray coast with news that a fleet with carved prows has been sighted in the Firth. The choices that grow a nation are usually made in moments like that, under breath, with one eye on the weather. What holds this all together is not certainty, but practice. People keep doing the things that say we, gathering at Scone, swearing oaths by saints both native and imported, sending their sons to a king's hall to learn a service, and their daughters into marriages that braided hills together. Alba, in the 10th century, is not a foregone conclusion. It is a lesson rehearsed each season. And yet, by the time Constantine's crowned head bows under a monk's cowl, the lesson has taken. The realm is smaller than our map Scotland, humbler, more vulnerable, but it is itself. It has a memory of being itself, and memory in a hard climate is a weapon. Later ages would scan these reigns for drama, as if every decade must end in a clang of arms. The truth is both less spectacular and more admirable. The early kings of Alba did what founders dream of their heirs doing. They persisted. They took a fragile, stitched thing and lived in it without tearing it, until the seams set. When, in centuries to come, a Bruce would call his people to stand in a field of marsh and thistle, he would be asking a nation to do what it had already learned here to say we and mean it. Stone arrived later than legend suggests. For generations after Alba learned to call itself by name, power still perched on timber ringworks and earth mounds crowned with palisades, halls of oak where smoke climbed and justice sat at a trestle table. But along with new ideas of rule came new ways to house it. From the 11th century onward, especially under kings who looked south and continent ward for models, mounds hardened into mottes, ditches bit deeper, and wood slowly ceded to stone. Scotland began to write its authority on the skyline. Castles were never merely walls, they were verbs. To build was to claim, to refit was to renew, to slight, to pull down with deliberate hand was to deny a rival his foothold. In the lowlands, where roads knit to markets and river crossings mattered, strongholds grew at choke points. Edinburgh's crown of basalt, Stirling's plug of volcanic rock cradling the Forth crossings, Dumbarton's twin crags clasping the Clyde, each was geography turned into law. Whoever held them did not just hold masonry. They pinned movement and, with it, memory. A generation might pass under the shadow of a banner on a battlement, and people would begin to think of the banner as natural to the place. In the Highlands and along the western sea locks, the architecture kept faith with the ground. There were fewer broad curtain walls and more hard, narrow towers shouldered into rock keeps that looked like additions to the cliff rather than interruptions of it. Islet stronghold castles on tidal rocks or in the lap of a loch took over where earlier island duns and crannogs had kept watch. If a rival came storming with a raiding band, a narrow causeway and a boat were better friends than an army. A Highland tower might be small, its great hall snug and dark in winter light, but it was a promise to kin when the heather burns. There's a door that bolts. Life inside was a contradiction that medieval people accepted as easily as weather splendor within austerity. In great halls, painted shields and hanging tapestries broke the gray of stone. A harp might sound against the low roar of a central fire, and a lord's steward call out the order of dishes, while dogs snored at the dais. Above or behind the hall, the solar, the Lord's private chamber, allowed business to be conducted off stage. Kitchens sweated in their corners. A buttery kept measure of ale. A pantry kept count of bread. A garderobe offered its vertiginous view and practical ending to a vertical shaft. Servants moved like water through passages that were the building's secret map. But a castle's most important rooms were not rooms. They were the spaces just outside the gate. A bailey or close held smithies, byres, and big houses. Beyond that, cottages clung to the curtain of the Lord's need. Markets grew at the foot of dependable walls. A burgh granted tolls and freedoms in return for its taxes and its loyalty. In many places, the sheriff's writ ran from a castle gate, the law descending the slope in the person of a mounted officer. In this way, stone translated kingship. What a king decreed in council could be felt as coin, heard as sentence, measured as grain. Siege taught Scotland, and Scotland taught siege. Timber ringworks might burn, but the stone needed patience. Attackers learned to starve rather than storm, to mine and to sap, to wheel up engines whose dignity was entirely at odds with their purpose. On a summer day in the early 14th century, when Edward of England brought his great trebuchet, later remembered, almost affectionately, as the war wolf to the walls near the Forth, he was making a statement as much as a breach. Your defiance will be answered by the largest machine in Christendom. And yet the record is full of nights when ladders on a cliff at the least guarded angle did the work of a season's worth of carpentry. A handful of men climbing the West Rock at Edinburgh, a gate unbarred by an ally, a postern discovered at low tide. Castles were proud, but pride is not the same thing as invulnerability. They changed hands. They became stories. In one winter of the 14th century, while England and Scotland wrestled for more than walls, a garrison faced down months of bombardment behind battlements and made the besiegers pay for every yard. In another season, a countess, later celebrated with sharp humor, kept her fortress by wit and obstinacy, dusting off assaults as if they were furniture. Children grew up on these tales. The stones themselves learned to listen. Not all stone endured. Robert Bruce, who knew that a castle in the wrong hands is an anchor for an enemy, ordered many slighted dismantled, so they could not be garrisoned against the realm. The message was harsh, better scars than occupation. You can still read those decisions in the landscape, the way a ridge suddenly loses its teeth and returns to grass. The medieval eye understood that ruin can be a kind of a strategy. For all their iron, the strongholds were also instruments of culture. In the Stuart century and before it, Hall life pulled in languages, fashions, and music from abroad. A mason hired from the Loire left his line in a corbel. A Flemish merchant's cloth swung from a beam. A manuscript with good initials lay open to the Psalms on a trestle. Hawking parties clattered through the gate at dawn. At dusk, juries of neighbors heard disputes and reached settlements hammered thin enough for both sides to swallow. In the Highlands, a harper recited lineage and deed in a room where every face knew every name. In the Lowlands, a clerk read out a charter whose Latin bound a town to the king in perpetuity. Stone gathered these acts and held their echoes. Weaponry altered spaces. as bows grew stronger and crossbows snapped through armor. Parapets found their crenels deeper, and merlins learned to shape. Arrow slits embrasures that widened inward like the neck of a jug flattered the archer's need for angle. When gunpowder spoke in the 15th century, walls thickened and bastions angled like shoulders. A castle that had once launched cavalry from its gate learned to sit and chew, shot like an old bull. Yet in much of Scotland, terrain remained the better defense. A marsh at your feet is cheaper than a bastion at your flank, and a cliff is a better engineer than any master mason. The difference between highland and lowland was not a contest of courage, but of purpose. A lowland fortress could be an office, the seat of a sheriffdom, the locker of royal rents, the place where sealed writs were opened. Its lord dealt in parchment and lawsuits as well as in steel. A highland castle was more plainly the hearth of a kin. When it sent men down the glen, they carried news as much as they carried spears. When it closed its gate, it closed around cousins. This difference grew 1,000 small misunderstandings between regions, and a nation learned to live with them. If we call castles symbols, we must remember that medieval people did not treat symbols as we do. For them, the sign was the thing. To kneel in a great hall and place your hands between your lords was not a metaphorical act. It altered your life. To see a royal banner fly from a keep was to know that justice would be rendered differently this month than last. To be told by a porter that you could not enter a gate you had always used was to learn something permanent about yourself. The Estones wrote these lessons in weatherproof script. They were expensive to build and more expensive to keep. A garrison eats, repairs multiply. Lead slips from a roof, and the winter's worth of meltwater becomes a summer's worth of rot. Even the richest lord depends on the patience of those he taxes. Many castles were sustained by a web of obligations: food renders due at harvest, days of labor due in spring, cartage due when timber must be drawn up the brae. People grumbled, people paid, people expected, in return, a wall to run to when the valley filled with riders who were not their friends. Watch the year turning around one of these strongholds, and you will see the kingdom inside its calendar. In Lent, quiet tables, a little fish. At Easter, candles flowering. In harvest, carts shouldering through the gate. In Advent, wool accounted, rents tallied, the steward scratching figures with a patience learned from monks. Gifts arrive: a hawk from a neighboring lord, a relic from a church hoping for favor, a poem from a bard whose words turn a debt into a courtesy, and sometimes less welcome news: a writ demanding men for the king's campaign, a sealed letter hinting at a feud reawakening downstream. There is a temptation to see all this as glamorous melancholy ruins under weather, tourists with cameras, a guide's voice drifting. Resist it. In their time, these places were noisy and practical. They smelled of horse and smoke and wet wool. They were workplaces, courthouses, granaries, armories, and, not least, homes. They held weddings that mended quarrels and funerals that reopened them. They stored grain against a bad spring and secrets against a worse winter. By the time wars of independence rolled their weight across the land, castles had matured from experiments into instruments. They would be taken, retaken, abused, adored, and sometimes murdered for the safety of those who loved them. After the storms, many would become gentler places, palaces where glass and garden joined garrison and gate. But in the crucible centuries, when Scotland learned to be Scotland, these stones taught communities how to gather, kings how to be present from afar, and enemies the cost of persistence. If you stand now on a windy ward and lay your palm on a wall, you'll feel the rough arithmetic of that lesson, blocks stacked into power, voids arranged into refuge, a people learning one course of a stone at a time how to endure. Say the name Macbeth, and the mind leaps to dagger-lit corridors and the restless scrape of guilt. But if we let the play's thunder quiet, another figure steps forward, less haunted, more human. He is a northern lord of Moray, bound by blood to older lines of kings, a patient strategist in an age that measured rule not by primogeniture, but by strength of claim, strength of kin, and a strength of hand. He rises in a Scotland where kingship is not a straight ladder, but a braided rope, tanistry cousins and uncles and sons sharing a thick web of rights, each strand ready to be pulled taut in crisis. And for nearly 17 years he holds. Macbeth's childhood is written at the edges of power. His father falls in the violence that so often accompanied a succession. His mother's lineage ties him to the house of Kenneth. When he marries Gruach, widow of Gila Cuemgain of Moray, herself descended from a rival royal branch, he does not merely gain a partner. He gathers a claim, a coalition, and a son to protect. The union is not the stage's fever dream of manipulation, but the careful politics of a land where a wedding is a treaty sewn with wool instead of wax. Duncan White, the king who faces him, is no saintly elder. He is young, vigorous, and ambitious, pushing campaigns beyond their means, leaning hard on the north. In 1040, the two forces meet near Elgin at Pitgavany, remembered also as Bothnaguan, where the earth favors Macbeth's way of fighting. Duncan falls in open battle. The chroniclers record no midnight murder, no hushed treachery in a guest chamber, only the blunt arithmetic of a field decided. And so Macbeth is hailed king, not as a skulking usurper, but as one victor among many in a century that makes kings by the sword's ascent. What follows is the surprise. He governs. He establishes order in a realm that has known lurching change. He leans toward the church, pragmatic piety, and the church leans back, offering not just prayer, but literacy, clerks, and the soft power of calendars that make communities beat in time. He distributes gifts. He maintains the roads of obligation, seeing that what is asked of a thane is balanced, if not with gentleness, then with predictability. His court listens to poets. His halls host judgments. His earls and Mormires, old titles clinging to older duties, learn that this king intends a steady hand. In 1050, rumors say, Macbeth goes to Rome. Imagine the journey a northerner under the Italian sun, tasting the scale of a church that stretches wider than any sea king's horizon. He is no penitent ghost in borrowed rags. He travels as a public man making a public gesture, distributing alms lavishly. The pilgrimage tells his own lords that their king's name carries weight beyond the firths. It tells other kings that the north is not a brute corner, but a participant in Christendom's conversation. At home, A charter is safer when your ruler's reputation is large enough to shelter it. Yet the North is never quiet for long. Moray's power, which Macbeth embodies, has always made the southern heartlands uneasy. Across the Firth, the Norse world watches Orkney and Caithness under a strong jarls, ships running like nerves along the coast. To the south, English politics organize themselves into a pressure that Scotland cannot ignore. Shyward, the iron-handed Earl of Northumbria, has his own map in mind. Edward the Confessor, all velvet to the eye, knows when to arm a cause. Into this mesh of neighbors steps Malcolm, Duncan's son, a boy at the time of his father's death, but a man now drawn forward by the memory of a crown and the promise of allies. In 1054, invasion. Dunsinane's name will carry a centuries of branches because one poet heard marching trees. The reality is less spectral, more exhausting. Siward's army grinds north, and Macbeth meets it. He is beaten bloodily, publicly, but not destroyed. A king in that age is not a city to be captured. He is a center of gravity to be dispersed, and Macbeth has a second center left. He retreats north with the loyalty he still commands, and for 3 more years he stands, striking where he can, refusing to vanish in the tidy way stories prefer. Lumphanan writes the last line. In 1057, on that Aberdeenshire ground, Malcolm and the men who have staked their future on him finally bring Macbeth down. The king dies as a soldier dies, in the press of a fight, not on a bed gnawed by fear. Almost at once, the coil of claims tightens again. Gruchas' son, Lulach, briefly, poignantly takes the kingship at Strathbogie and Scone, an affirmation that Moray's line will not go silent. In 1058, he too is cut down. Malcolm Canmore becomes Malcolm III, and the kingdom slides into a new arrangement. What then of the witches, the bloody hands, the sleep that will not settle? They belong to another argument, not with Macbeth, but with time. 6 centuries later, a playwright writes for a king named James, 6th of Scotland and 1st of England, a man who traces his line where it needs to be traced, and who has, in his own reign, stared too long into the dark cupboard of witchcraft and found fear there. The stage bends history to flatter and to warn Banquo, turned into a noble ancestor, Macbeth, tuned into a cautionary drum, prophecy as speaking like riddles, because politics in 1606 are riddled with anxieties. The fiction is brilliant. It is also a mirror for a different century, polished to reflect a patron's face. Walk back from the theater to the 13th century road and the 11th century hall. The portrait you meet is plainer and, to my ear, more honest, a competent ruler in a hard age, who stabilizes what he can, resists when he must, and falls as many good kings fell outnumbered at last. If he is stern, so are his neighbors. If he is strategic, so are his enemies. The cruelty of his legend is that it steals not only his dignity, but Gruch's, turning a canny noblewoman into a shape of appetite when, in truth, she is that era's ordinary miracle, a woman in a world of iron-making kinship serve survival. Her son, by her first marriage, becomes king. Her marriage to Macbeth kneads 2 claims into one administration. Her life is not accident, but agency. Consider, too, how the map of Scotland shapes his story. Moray is not a province so much as a posture a north that claims to be the kingdom's equal half rather than its far room. For generations, it will generate kings or kingmakers, because the width of its land and the depth of its ties make that inevitable. When Macbeth holds the throne, he is not a stranger at Scone. He is the expression of a settlement in which the North takes its turn. That he falls to a southern-backed claimant is not proof of villainy. It is proof that the rope of Tanistry has tightened again, knotting in a different direction. Did people whisper? Of course. Kings attract rumor like iron attracts lightning. If Macbeth's justice fell hard on some, their grandsons would tell the story with darker eyes. If a tax felt heavy, a priest might record it as a moral failing instead of a fiscal one. The play later harvests these whisperings like berries and cooks them into wine, but the harvest is selective. The annals that note his gifts, his pilgrimage, the long length of his reign, these too are evidence. 17 years is an eternity for a tyrant in that century. Tyranny eats its own seasons. Macbeth's government, by contrast, keeps its calendar. His afterlife in Scotland is quieter than his afterlife on the stage. But you can still hear it if you stand in the north and listen. Place names remember, mounds keep secrets badly. In Moray, the fields that felt the footfall of his retainers remember with their horizons, and the parishes that took alms from a king retain the faint habit of saying his name without a spitting. If you picture him at dawn, picture him more often with a steward than with a dagger bent over accounts, reckoning how to feed a winter garrison without starving a summer village. That is the true labor of medieval kingship, and it is less thrilling than prophecy, but more difficult than murder. None of this cancels a Shakespeare. Art and record are not enemies, they are neighbors. One tells us how a later age wanted to feel about power and fate. The other tells us how an earlier age survived them. Between them stands a man who, for a time, carried the North and the crown, who met his rival in battle instead of in bedchamber shadow, and who, in the thick weave of Scotland's early kingdom, left a line as straight as any king can hope. For rule well, fall fighting, be remembered honestly by those you fed. If the world has given him a darker mask, perhaps it is because darkness makes better theater. History, which loves the twilight more than the midnight, prefers him without it. Imagine Scotland lifting its eyes from hill forts and Kinbons and seeing, on the southern horizon, a new grammar of power arrive on horseback men in mail. Words on parchment, towers in a stone. The change does not fall in a single season. It comes in a tide first, a curious ripple under Malcolm Canmore, then a confident flood beneath his sons, and, most of all, under David Warp. It is not conquest as England knew it in 1066. It is invitation, bargain, imitation, a northern kingdom choosing, shrewdly and selectively, to take from the Norman world what could strengthen its own. Begin with marriage and chapel. Malcolm's queen. Margaret raised in exile, schooled in Latin prayers and courtly discipline, brings to Dunfermline a different cadence of devotion. She smooths the rough edges of an older church, urges standard fasts, corrects festal reckonings, renews the keeping of Sunday. Her piety is practical, more altars, better books, alms set in order rather than scattered. If the old faith felt like a wild spring, Margaret helps it run as a channel. In this, she is no mere saint of scented legend. She's a policy in a veiled discipline that makes a kingdom legible, clerks that make decisions durable, a royal household that turns custom into habit. Under her sons, especially Edgar and Alexander Norman, and English guests become Norman and English neighbors. But the revolution has a date and a name, 1124, David for sure. He has grown to manhood in Anglo-Norman courts, watching how parchment and pointed arches could do what a spears alone could not. When he takes the Scottish throne, he sets out to stitch that logic into Alba's cloth without tearing its warp. The old Gaelic Mormayers become earls, still mighty. But now within frameworks a scribe can describe. Sheriffdoms appear at Perth, at Stirling, at Edinburgh royal eyes and hands extending into Shire and a strand. What once was obligated by memory is now written, sealed, witnessed. Castles multiply, at first in timber on thrown-up mounds, then in a stone keeps that, make a lord's intent visible from far down the road. These are not mere bastions. They are statements. Here is jurisdiction. Here, a market will draw. Here, the king's coin will pass, and coins do pass. Royal mints strike silver pennies that move through hands in burgh markets, making value portable, measurable, taxable. Wool soft wealth combed from hill and lowland travels east to Flanders in ship bellies. Hides and fish follow. Salt and wine return. The burghs become the king's brightest tools. Roxburgh, Berwick, Perth, Stirling, Edinburgh, strings of markets and law around the waist of the realm. Burgesses take up burgage plots, long strips facing the street, with rights to trade and obligations to pay. A guild sings its quiet rules over a bench. Weights must be true. Cloths must be full measure. Ale must be honest. Names change the sound of court. Fitzalans, the future as Stuarts, de Bruce, de Morville, de Balliol. Common families with French in their mouths and charters in their saddlebags. They come not as overlords from a foreign king, but as men who have wagered their fortunes on a Scottish sovereign eager to make his crown outlast a generation. Land is their price and their promise in exchange for knights' service and the stone fortification. They receive forests to hunt and fields to manage. Some later mutter, Sir David, Sir did ye let or land, as if generosity were weakness. But the ledger line beneath the lament is shrewd. With these men come the durable customs of fee and relief, scutage and suit, a politics that can be summoned by writ rather than by smoke. David's ecclesiastical map redraws the nation. Augustinian canons take root at Holyrood and St. Andrews. Cistercians make white houses at Melrose. Newbattle, Kinloss, Dundrennan, spinning prayer into field rotation, fish ponds, and sheep flocks that hum with coin. Benedictine Dunfermline grows like a ribcage around the royal heart. Monks bring not only the habit of hours, but the arts of keeping accounts, copying law, and measuring land with cords instead of quarrels. A nave rises in ashlar, an arcade Romanesque first, then pointed Gothic, so that even the air educates, teaching eyes to travel upward through disciplined curves. Architecture becomes pedagogy for obedience and aspiration. Law takes a seat and stays in it. Scotland will never be England, but she learns from her neighbors' tidy habits. Custom is inked into codes. The sheriff's moot gathers suitors. Pleas are pleaded to form instead of to force. Older jurisdictions survive leges inter Bretos et Scotos, that is, the laws between Britons and Scots continue to handle kinds of quarrel the new forms do not grasp well. But the direction is set fewer sudden violences, more predictable exactions. It is not kindness exactly, it is predictability, and that alone can feel like mercy to a crofter who guesses now, with better odds, how much of his barley will travel upwards unseen. Language becomes a stack. Latin in the scriptorium and at the seal, French at the high table where guests call each other sir, Gaelic is still powerful in the west and north, the tongue of kin and vow, and in the busy towns, Scots, the burghers, a speech thickening into a law-worthy medium. With each tongue comes a way of measuring honor. In Gaelic, a man is wealth by his cattle and friends. In French, he is tenure and reputation. In Latin, he is line on a page, linked to other lines by the chain of testibus witnesses who will swear what happened happened. The kingdom learns to carry 4 codes at once. Not all of this is southern. To the west and the Isles, another experiment blooms Norse and Gael, not into new lords whose power rides the sea. Somerlet, a name like a keel, rises in the mid-12th century, carving out a realm that answers to neither York nor Ascone. Later it will be called the Lordship of the Isles, and while David's burghers count, these ship lords sing. Scotland absorbs even this by patience. It will be a long politics of treaties, marriages, and occasional splintering. For now, it is enough to know that the kingdom's heart is learning Norman order while its edges still speak in other tempos. Conflict, being human, does not depart. In 1138, campaigning for his niece the Empress in England's Civil War, David's northern men meet the English at the Battle of the Standard and are bloodily held. The defeat checks appetite but not ambition for years. David, or his son Henry, will hold a sway in Northumbria and Cumbria, proof that the Davidian revolution has teeth as well as pens. Back home, new churches, new mills, and new markets grow where royal favor points. The old aristocracy adapts as much as it resists. An earl with Gaelic poets in his hall can still inspect a charter with a Norman clerk and see advantage in the margin. And the people who do not sit in halls, they live more under the calendar than under the crest. The rhythm of saints' days, market days, court days. This is the empire that actually occupies a villager. Toft and croft define a household's shape. The right to grind at the Lord's mill pinches the purse. The sheriff's next ire will bring a reckoning for a boundary walked poorly. Nothing in this is romantic, but there is a certain relief in the regular, a fine instead of a feud, a rent instead of a raid. The dangers remain winter, sickness, a lord's anger, but the new kingdom, with its bursaries and books, gives the commoner one extra way to survive petition. Through it all, the castles keep watch. Some grow into palatial estatements, Royal Stirling, Royal Edinburgh, where tapestries soften what arrows have built, and where the monarch performs not only might but membership in continental royalty. Tournaments arrive more disciplined than a spectacle training lords to turn violence into ritual. Heralds assort colors into a grammar. Seals learn to speak in images. Lions rampant, treasures flory counter flory. The thistle beginning to think itself a symbol. Of course, such abundance carries a cost. A kingdom that writes itself becomes a kingdom that must keep writing. Every grant answered by another. Every monastery's exemption paid for by somebody else's tax. Tension gathers, invisible as a static. Some later quarrels the commons against the Bruces. The guardianship crises after a child king's death will be sharper because the players are now so well armed with documents. But for the moment, this 12th century moment, you can feel the country drawing breath and height. Sheep count for coin, market bells cut the afternoon, bells from choir call the dawn. A people that once called its wealth to pasture now calls it to table. What you hear, if you listen beneath the hammer and chant, is an intention that Scotland should be something Europe recognizes, without ceasing to be itself. It will not work cleanly. The Highlands keep their stubborn freedoms. The Isles keep their tides. Yet the frame David and his heirs raise will be the frame that later kings must defend when a hammer from the south falls again. For the wars of independence will not be fought merely for hills and glens. They will be fought for burgh charters and the right to coin, for sheriffdoms and the dignity of a seal, this whole new fabric of written Scotland, strong enough to bind, bright enough to be worth the risk of tearing. Before the first banner of rebellion is lifted, there is an empty chair. Alexander III falls from his horse on a storming night. The Maid of Norway dies before she can set foot on her kingdom. And a Scotland so newly organized under sheriffs and charters finds itself leaderless, riven by claims. The great lords submit their pedigrees like swords laid flat on a table. Edward of England offers to judge the matter, and in 1292 his judgment names John Balliol king. A king, yes, but one forced to kneel to another. When Balliol reaches for the scepter, Edward tugs at the chain. Obligations multiply. Edward summons his vassal north and south, sifts Scottish appeals in his own courts, and draws Scotland into his war against France. Scottish nobles, stung, sign the old alliance with the French in 1295 if England strikes one. The other will answer. Edward replies not with parchment but with iron. In 1296, his army comes over the border like weather. Berwick is taken in a day of horror. Traytown becomes killing ground. Dunbar falls. John Balliol is adrift, mocked, and sent away. The ragman roll is opened, pages and pages of noble names, compelled to swear fealty. A nation seems folded and put away. And yet, in the folds, sparks. The stories tell of a tall man in gray, quick as a salmon through reeds, who will not bend at the knee. William Wallace's first certain footfalls are faint in the record and loud in the legend. One tale says, a skirmish at Lanark lit his fuse, an English sheriff fallen under his blade after insult and abuse. What matters is the pattern that follows. Raids begin to thread, the lowland dusk garrisons harried, storehouses emptied, a rumor riding ahead of every hoofbeat that someone, somewhere, is still unwilling. He is not alone. In the north, Andrew Moray Young, fierce, just escaped from an English prison, raises the banner at Avach and Castle of Ormond. Two separate fires catch on distant hills and, in months, begin to see each other's glow. They do not meet face to face until the fourth is between them, a narrow wooden bridge trembling with English steel. It is September 1297. The English commanders are John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham. The English plan is a simple march across, scatter rebels, dine by evening, the ground and the Scots upon it. Plan otherwise. If you stand on Abbey Crag above the bend in the river at Stirling, you can still feel how the land itself chose sides. To cross, the English must file tight along the timbers. On the far bank, marsh sucks at hooves. Beyond, a little rise waits, bristling. Wallace and Moray hold their men in check, and waiting becomes its own kind of courage. Only when the enemy is half across, when order can no longer flex, do the Scots move. Schiltrons of spears drive downhill. Panic travels the planks faster than any horse. Cressingham is cut down, men drown in armor within sight of safety. What the chronicles later call the Battle of Stirling Bridge is not a grand melee. It is a hinge. The door of possibility swings open, hard. The victory is not clean. Moray is wounded. He will die of it within months. Yet in the first sharp breath after triumph, Wallace's stature swells beyond his own height. Whether knighted by the nobles or hailed by necessity, he becomes guardian of the realm of Scotland. His seal is struck. His Latin letters go forth to Lubeck and Hamburg, inviting merchants to return, promising that Scotland's ports live again, that the roads are safe enough for wool and wine to find each other. It is not only a soldier's boast, it is a policy independence must feed itself. Guardian is a difficult word to wear. To guard a realm is to balance the jealousies of its strongest men. The commons weigh him, the Bruces watch him, churchmen bless him, then count their losses. Wallace moves with the gravity of a man who has stepped into a crown-shaped absence and found it heavy. He cannot be everywhere at once. English garrisons still hold castles. The countryside bruises under counter-raids. Edward himself turns north in the summer of 1298, a vast army at his back, Welsh archers on his wings, a king determined to make example. At Falkirk, the open field is unkind. Wallace sets his Schiltrons, great hedgehogs of spears, on firm ground, knowing they can stop cavalry if their hearts do not break. For an hour they do not break. Arrows whistle into the air, falling like sudden winter. The Scots light archers cannot answer in number, and some of the mounted nobles peel away, resentments rising like old ghosts. Edward's cavalry wheel and wheel until a hole opens, the Schiltrons buckle, the killing becomes close work. By dusk, the Guardian's army is torn. He does what true Guardians do. He does not cling to office when clinging will harm the ward. Wallace resigns his guardianship. Others take it up, John Comyn and, briefly, Robert Bruce, men of lineage, with claims and quarrels older than Wallace's fame. He slips instead into the gray places, ambush, winter trail, sudden blade. There are whispers that he crosses to France, that he petitions for aid at a court where the Auld Alliance is more promise than army. Whether or not the King of France hears him kindly, Europe hears Scotland's name spoken with a stubbornness again. Years pass, and the English tighten their hold. In 1304, after long sieges and longer hunger, most Scottish nobles submit at Stirling to Edward's terms. The law books and treasuries are carried south. The Stone of Scone already lies in Westminster, a trophy at a conqueror's feet. One man refuses the page. Wallace, landless and hunted, continues to be what he has always been for those who need him, proof by motion that the cause yet breathes. Betrayal is a royal coin. It buys dearly. In August 1305, a Scottish knight, John de Menteith, effects Wallace's capture near Glasgow. Bound and hurried south, The rebel hears London before he sees it, the press of people, the clamor of markets, the steady thud of a capital that believes it has won. He is tried not as an enemy, but as a traitor, though he never swore fealty to Edward, and condemned in a theater of merciless ceremony, hanged, cut down, disemboweled, beheaded. His head is set upon a spike on London Bridge. His limbs are dispatched north to glower over gatehouses, as if anger alone could keep them from decay. Such punishments are meant to close the book. They do something stranger here. They slip a page of fire into it. The English intend terror. The Scots remember testimony. Mothers hush children with his name, not in fear, but in fierce reassurance. 2 generations later, a poet will gild him into a giant. Long after that, a film will paint his face blue. Those are mirrors with ripples. What lasts in a steadier glass is simpler, a common man who should not have mattered, and therefore mattered more, stood up when professional power had knelt, struck once, and showed the country that its bones were not broken. The political ledger does not end with an epitaph. Wallace's example moves through other hands. Robert Bruce, who once pulled against him, will learn the pace and patience of the guerrilla war Wallace waged, cutting at garrisons, starving their courage, refusing to stand still until the ground chooses him. When Bruce's axe meets the bowhun at Bannockburn, part of the blade's swing comes from Wallace's first decision to wait on Abbey Craig. When Bruce orders castles slighted rather than re-garrisoned, he follows Wallace's intuition, deny the enemy stone, and he must fight the land. Nor is Wallace's legacy only a strategic, it is administrative, in its small way. His letters to the hands remind later Gordians and kings that independence is not simply a word shouted over a shield. It is wool measured true, harbors free of piracy, roads passable enough that a pack horse completes the week's journey more often than not. A nation that will one day write the Declaration of Arbroath, claiming that a people's freedom lies not in any single man, but in the whole community, has already rehearsed the script in a rebel's seal sent to merchants abroad. We are open for our own business. If you walk the field at Falkirk at dusk, the grass hides dead, and the road sings with tires, indifferent to old calamities. If you stand on the crest above the Forth, the wind comes the same way it came to Wallace, sharp off water. The land is patient. It remembers quietly. It yields its memory to those who ask without clamor. What it gives in the Wallace story is the shape of a beginning, not the end of occupation that will take other winters, other men, but the first refusal carved clean enough to be understood at distance. No, not like this, not forever. When the Scottish child of a later century hears that his limbs were sent to northern towns, he may ask which towns and find different answers in different books. He may ask how tall the man was and be told different inches. It hardly matters. The measure that counts is the one the nation took of itself when it watched a commoner called to the bar of empire and not bend. For a people still learning to be a country, that is a lesson you can pack like bread for a long journey. It does not go stale. Robert Bruce does not arrive as a statue. He arrives as a man with too many loyalties and not enough room to carry them all. For years he has kept one foot in the English camp and one in the Scottish. hedging his chances like any great lord in a dangerous century. Then, in the winter of 1306, the balancing act breaks in a small church at Dumfries. Anger and calculation meet John Comyn, and Comyn falls. The floor is a stone. The choice is final. There is no more middle road for Robert Bruce. Within weeks, he is crowned at Scone, a king without a kingdom, excommunicated and hunted, less a monarch than a target with a circlet. Kingship in the Scotland is not a throne you sit upon, it is ground you stand upon and do not surrender. At Methven that summer, English arms smash Bruce's little court to pieces. At Dalry he is scattered again. His brothers are taken, his followers dwindle, his queen and women of his household will soon be prisoners. The legends say he watches a spider stitch a web, tries, fails, tries again. Whether or not that little parable is true, the next movements are Bruce disappears into islands and winter, into heather and sea caves and silence, and he begins to re-enter his country along the edges where walls are few and memory is long. Guerrilla war is not only ambush, it is discipline. Bruce studies the lie of burns and bog, the choke points of fords, the habit of garrisons. He chooses officers who can master their tempers as well as their swords. Thomas Randolph, James Douglas, Robert Keith, and he teaches the old hedgehog formations of spearmen, schiltrons, to move instead of merely endure. Where the enemy expects a prickly thicket, he means to show them a rolling wood, advancing. He refuses the English a safe chair in any fortress if a castle is taken and cannot be held. He has it slighted, its walls wrecked, so it will feed no future occupation. It is a policy both ruthless and merciful, fewer sieges, fewer starving towns. In the northeast, he answers common power with purpose. The grain lands of Buchan, heart of his enemies, are harried fields laid waste to break their strength. In Galloway and the west, he turns sea lanes into arteries for his cause. The Black Douglas, on a Palm Sunday, retakes his father's keep with a trick and leaves the grisly Douglas larder to warn garrisons that no garrison is truly safe. Others copy the art. One day a hay cart jams the gate at Linlithgow and pours out armed men. Another night, Randolph's climbers turn the impossible face of Edinburgh Castle into a ladder. Day by ordinary day, Scotland's map changes shade. The English crown still weighs heavy. Edward White dies in 1307, iron-willed to the last, his bones almost a campaign on their own. His son, Edward II, inherits a larger army than he does patience. The new king's attention wanders south, his northern commanders bicker, his friends become factions. Bruce does not waste the weather. He beats down resistance in the north and west, gathers men to him, and turns again to the central belt where the road of Scotland narrows between highland and lowland like a neck one thumb can press. At Stirling stands the great hinge. Edward Bruce, the king's brother, arranges terms with the English constable. If no relief arrives by midsummer of 1314, the castle will be surrendered. It is a bold promise and a trap of parchment. Edward II must now bring an army, or he must watch one of his last major strongholds pass with the calendar. He chooses pride and marches, and England marches with him. Knights clatter north, banners bright, archers fill the lanes and hedgerows, wagons groan under barrels. It is a host large enough to impress even its own myths. Robert Bruce chooses his ground. South of Stirling, at the new park, the country breaks into woodland and rough pasture. Beyond a stretch, the karstlands, low and wet, where the burns of Bannock and Pellstream thread the fields and turn hooves into anchors. The fordable ways are few, the space to deploy cavalry shrinks with every step. Bruce's men dig pits and plant them with sharpened stakes. They walk the ground until it is a map in their bones. They are fewer, but they are at home. On the eve of St. John, a young English Earl Gloucester urges caution. He's overruled. Patrols feel for each other in the afternoon light. Then comes the small scene set like a jewel that every schoolchild knows. An English knight, Henry de Bohun, sees a rider in a plain crown across the hollow, Bruce himself, light in the saddle with only a handful near him. De Bohun lowers his lance and charges. The ground, the air, the moment stand very still. Bruce waits, turns at the last heartbeat, and with a single axe blow shatters the helmet and the head beneath. The Scots cheer. The king's men scold him later for risking so much to win so little. But morale is a currency you spend or hoard, and this coin lands loud. Morning comes to June 24th with mist hanging in folds in the low ground. Edward's army is vast but cramped, pushed by numbers into places that will not hold them comfortably. Bruce's schiltrons, drilled to move, step forward like ripples, not braced statues. Thomas Randolph holds the road to Stirling against a detachment. Their encounter a quick, terrible press of spear on horse. James Douglas shadows any English attempt to slip men around the flanks. The English archers begin to bite, arrowhead after arrowhead falling into Scottish ranks. Then Robert Keith leads the small Scottish cavalry in a sudden charge, not into the schiltrons or at the knights, but across the line of bowmen. On open ground, archers rule. Among hooves and panic, they are trampled, and the arrow storm thins to a stray rain. The English heavy horse, hemmed and goaded, plunges again and again into a world grown narrower than it looked from the hill. Bog sucks, spear points bloom, riders fall and rise and fall again, caught, crushed, drowned. Command phrase under the weight of too many lances and too little room to point them in. Somewhere Gloucester goes down, elsewhere standards tilt and topple. A rumor runs that the baggage is threatened. From the Scottish camp, the non-combatants, small folk, servants advance with blankets held as banners, and a forest of waving cloth looks, to a tired eye, like another army coming. It is enough to persuade an army already leaning that it is time to run. Edward II does not rally the day, he survives it. He is hurried from the field, pushed along by men who care more for a living king than a lost cause, and rides hard to Dunbar and a ship. Behind him he leaves armor, wagons, pride, and prisoners. The tally of dead is a litany of names that will change politics in England for years. Before him, Bruce's men kneel and raise a prayer of thanks, a quiet moment in a place soaked with noise. Bannockburn is not the end of the war. Victory rarely is, but it is a turning of the weight from one side of the scale to the other. Over the next years, the Scots carry raids deep into northern England, not to conquer it, but to force a treaty through empty granaries and sleepless nights. In 1320, the nobles and commons of Scotland send a letter to a distant pope, a document we know as the Declaration of Arbroath. Its grammar is the grammar of piety and politics. yet clear in its center is a conviction learned in long struggle that a people's freedom does not lie only in one man's person, even a good king, and that, if a king betrays the commonweal, another must be found. It is a hard conclusion, and a modern-sounding one, hammered out in the smithy of disaster and recovery. 8 years after the battle, England bends parchment where it could not bend steel. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton recognizes Scotland as a separate realm and Robert as its rightful king. The road to the treaty is not smooth. The ink does not end jealousy or border forays, but it marks a fact that the landscape already knows. The castles Bruce left in ruin have done their grim work. The schiltrons that learned to walk have taught a continent that infantry, well led and well placed, can slow the proudest charge. The merchants Bruce courted find their way again to Scottish quays. The wool walks south and wine walks north. Government begins to look less like emergency and more like habit. There is no need to set Bruce in marble to see his height. He made mistakes. He made amends. He learned. He was ruthless when he thought the ground required it. Patient when patience would buy him a better field. Cautious until caution looked like surrender. And then bold enough to spend his life in the space of one horse length. He did not so much defeat England as make it uneconomical to remain, which is a subtler victory and a sturdier one. Stand today where the boarstone is said to have stood, where Bruce may have planted his banner. The traffic hums, the grass runs like water in wind. The burn is a quiet threading through reeds. It is easy to imagine great armies here. It is harder to feel the smaller labors that made the day possible, the weeks of drilling until men trusted one another's steps, the nights of mapping the ground with the soles of their feet, the decision to spare no stone that could be reused against them. Bannockburn is a blaze, but blazes are built from tinder gathered in ordinary weather. And if you carry Wallace's name forward to this field, as every Scot did then, and many still do now, you can feel the current joining. The man who showed a country it could stand was answered by the king who showed it how to stand longer. Between them lies a decade of loss and learning that becomes, in memory, a single chord refusal, patience, chosen ground, and the sudden swing of an axe when the moment calls. Peace comes to Scotland in flickers, lamplight at a cottage window, a calf born without trouble, a summer of decent rain, and then the wind shifts and the glass goes dark. Bannockburn had proved a nation could hold its ground. It did not teach neighbors to forget old slights. Beyond charters and treaties, there is a web of memory, and in that web tug the names of forebears, fields, cattle, and oaths made over knives. In the glens, a man is born into a story already moving, and the story all too often is a feud. Think of a Highland valley at dusk, the hills black against a long, pale sky. Smoke climbs straight up, dogs thread quietly through the heather. Inside, by peat glow, elders speak the liturgy of grievance. This pasture fenced too far. That heifer lifted on a moonless night. A cousin struck down on the road to a Lammas fair. Children learn these cadences with their letters. The words are not shouted, they are folded into bread. A clan is not a surname, but a shelter, a kin group bound by blood, by fosterage, by marriages arranged across the water, and by bonds of man-rent signed or spoken promises of mutual defense. To belong is to have a place to run toward when horns blow on the rich, but also to have a place others will come to take. Cattle are the bank. Wealth walks on 4 legs and grazes. To steal a herd is to write your name on another man's winter. To recover it is to reclaim your own. A raid creech is arranged with a care that would flatter any general scouts in the passes. Garrons saddled, torches ready but hooded, streams measured for their fordability. If the raid succeeds, the night fills with the soft thunder of hooves. If it fails, the hot trot begins. Neighbors roused by a burning sod brandished on a spear, and by horn calls that pull men from beds into mist and hurry. The law will bless pursuit taken in the first hours. After that, justice cools, and debts harden into the long arithmetic of revenge. Across the north and west, the sea is a road. Galleys the long, lean Berlins pull like fish through tideways between Skye and Mull, Islay and Kintyre, bearing warriors whose loyalties braid the Hebrides to Ulster. Islesmanship as mercenaries to Ireland Gallowglass with mail and great axes, and Irish names answer in turn to Scottish chieftains when a quarrel threatens to tilt toward disaster. That crossing is not a frontier, but a neighborhood. Songs do not bother to ask whether they are Irish or Scottish. They are Gaelic, and they are sung, eastward and south, in the arable lowlands. Feuding puts on a different coat but keeps the same knife. Great houses gather satellites through livery, and maintenance lords promising protection. Lesser men promising service, and a quarrel between 2 magnates rolls their countryside into its wheels. Bonds of friendship are written in Latin on parchment and sealed with wax. Yet they are also written in the way a market town leans toward one castle and away from another, in which kirk a sheriff chooses for his assize, in how quickly a tenant admits to paying blackmail protection money so that his barns will see harvest. Along the border with England, where the earth remembers too many armies, entire surnames Armstrong, Elliot, Graham, Scott come to be synonymous with riding by night and volleying into a byre door before the dog can wake. In many seasons, the marches are less a line and more a trade, and the goods traded are grudges. Kings do not sleep well in such a country. They tour, they summon, they judge, they send out their justices in air to hold courts in burgs, where the streets are barely paved and the smell of tallow hangs under timber galleries. They demand hostages for good behavior from chiefs who bell with courtesy and then slip back into the cover of their hills. They break the extra large houses Albany forfeited. Douglas checked and hoped that lesser powers will spend their appetites on smaller meals. Sometimes the crown is lucky enough to be worn by a man who likes work, one who will sit the length of a winter day listening to cases of land and lineage until a room of tired men accepts the verdict, because the verdict is every detail they told him mirrored back. Sometimes the crown is borne by a youth, and the youth is governed by kin with plans, and peace becomes another word for somebody else's turn. None of this is only a story of men. A feud is carried, often, by those who never lift a blade. Women nail shutters against rumor and welcome it in with broth. They note who came to the christening and who stayed away. They memorize the kinship map that turns a wedding into a pact or a danger. A widow can stall a quarrel by insisting on terms, or sharpen it by refusing a match. Children are fostered out to other houses as hostages and as human bridges. Those bridges sometimes hold. A chieftain's hall is a court, yes, but also a school in which a young poet learns to turn old wrongs into bright syllables, and so make them last. Religion weaves itself through both restraint and provocation. The local abbot may be a cousin to one lord and a confessor to another. A sanctuary can be honored out of habit or violated because the blood is too hot. Monasteries keep records, deeds, and charters and bonds, so friars who wish for peace become clerks to quarrel. Yet the calendar helps. At midsummer and Michaelmas, with harvests to bring in and saints to honor, even hard men soften a little. A pilgrimage to a holy well may set two rival processions walking side by side and teach their feet the trick of moving in the same direction for an hour. The habit of prayer does not end feuds. It sometimes delays them long enough that a grandchild looks back and cannot find the precise place the anger began. In the highlands, the greatest turbulence gathers around a floating court at sea, the lordship of the isles, whose chiefs rule from deck and castle by the grace of their oars. Their power is not a rebellion against the Scottish crown so much as an older style of kinging that refuses to die sovereignty measured in harbors and hearths along the ocean roads, in the language on people's tongues, in how many warriors can be called by a single trumpet. For a time, the crown tolerates it, bargains with it, uses it. In other years, when royal nerves affray or opportunity arrives, Edinburgh reaches for it with iron and law. The lesson is familiar. Too much liberty in one hand unbalances all the others. Too harsh a cure rips the patient. When peace does come, it comes most reliably in the work of days. Markets knit rivalries into trade. A Campbell sells a salt fish to a MacDonald without reminding him of goats. A Gordon's factor buys a Forbes's wool because the price is fair and the roads were dry. Ballads take the sharp edges off in rhyme. Young men who should be enemies discover they can lay a plaid together on the same hillside and argue about piping instead of cattle. A good harvest matters more than a good insult. A poor harvest matters more still. Hunger cancels eloquence. From the castle's view, the kingdom looks like a chessboard crowded with restless knights. From the byre door, it looks like weather cyclical, unpredictable, larger than a single life, yet always felt in the single life. The crown keeps writing statutes against carrying swords on Sundays, against gatherings too large for weddings, against the practice of a sorning, that soft tyranny of lords' men eating a poor household into winter. Wardens in the marches agree on days of truce and rings of steel in which quarrels can be spoken instead of swung. None of it ends the next night ride, but some of it constitutes a net tiers repaired between storms. Because we read history forward, we are always tempted to applaud the centralizing kings and sigh at the fractious chiefs. The truth is less tidy. The clans are a machine for survival in thin country. Their feuds are the shadow of their loyalty. The crown, anxious to make Scotland legible to itself, tears at old fabrics and sews new ones in their place. Some seams hold, some split. Out of the argument hill with hall, sword with a seal, grows a nation both prickly and proud, suspicious of overreach, stubborn against submission. The very qualities that make enforcement hard also make conquest harder still. Stand then on a bridge over a fast highland burn and listen. Upstream you will hear the old shouts' names called in anger, hooves on stones, the splash of cattle hurried away in darkness. Downstream you may hear something else, a fair day bell, the clatter of pack ponies, a harp carried in its leather coat. Both sounds define the place. Scotland learns slowly to live with both a country mastering the art of making peace between tempers and of keeping that peace long enough that children grow without needing to memorize the whole litany of wrongs, long enough, at least, for the next act to begin. Dynasties do not begin with fanfare. They begin with a signature and a silence. In 1371, when Robert, a Stuart grandson of Robert the Bruce, through his daughter Marjorie, took the throne as Robert II, Scotland did not suddenly change its gait, but the kingdom had, at last, a line that could last. Stuart was once an office, the high steward of the realm. Now it was a family, and over 3 uneasy, creative centuries, that family would pull power toward the crown, sometimes gently, sometimes with a jerk that left finger marks on history. Robert II was no hammer king. He was cautious and often delegated, a habit that let branches of his own house grow as thick as trunks. His sons learned to govern by governing in his stead. They also learned to like it. In his long reign, the realm stabilized just enough for burghs to fatten on wool and hides, and for the law to be heard more regularly than the sword. Yet the north simmered, the isles minded their own councils, and the king's household, where the Stuarts held purse and keys, became the true engine room of rule. Robert's bequest to Scotland was continuity, the sense that next year would find a Stuart still in the royal chair. Continuity, alas, is not always clarity. His son John, bruised by a riding accident and the jests that followed, styled himself Robert III on taking the crown as if a new name could stiffen a failing leg. His reign is a dolorous page, a monarch overshadowed by great lords, a father who watched his elder son, the flamboyant Duke of Rothesay, fall into the hands of enemies and die at Falkland in custody. Whispers said of neglect, starvation, and politics arranged as fate, fearing the same net. Robert III sent his younger boy, James, to France. Pirates and chance delivered the prince instead into English hands. When the king died, he is said to have called himself the worst of kings and the most miserable of men. The crown passed to an absent child. 17 winters later, the child returned a man. James I came home in 1424 from English captivity with an education, a steel determination, and a list. He had watched how order is made. He meant to make it. He audited crown lands, tightened customs, summoned parliaments until they remembered how to be worked, and leaned hard on those who confused their own dignity with the estates. He patronized poets and may have written verses himself. He also sent for masons, musicians, and moneyers. It is an old paradox of rulership. Men who love harp music can be flint when they must. In February 1437, at the Blackfriars in Perth, conspirators forced their way into the royal lodgings. The king tried to hide in a drain. The floorboards had just been repaired. They found him and stabbed him over and over. His queen, Joan, bloodied her hands fighting them off, and saved the dynasty by saving their son. The lesson James had nearly taught law before lordship came through anyway, because enough men found they liked the feel of a crown that did not wobble. James II inherited a kingdom still full of barons who considered themselves weather. He answered with thunder. The young king's name is tied by rumor and tradition to a scene so dark it feels like theater, the Black Dinner of 1440, when the boy king, scarcely 10, watched a black bull's head served before the young Earl of Douglas and his brother, and afterward the brothers were seized and executed. Whether James II could choose anything in that moment is doubtful. What matters is what he chose later. Grown, he faced the mighty Douglases again and would not share. In 1452 at Stirling, he killed the 8th Earl in a quarrel turned deadly, and then broke Douglas' power with war and seizures. He favored new weapons, huge bombards that spoke in stone, and took them to the English-held castle of Roxburgh in 1460. A gun burst as he stood near it. Iron and oak tore him open. He died in the fire that he had ordered kindled. His army took Roxburgh anyway and razed it. Artillery had come to Scotland's politics, so had the idea that a king's will could be louder than a lineage. If James II was iron, his son James III was glass reflective, cultured, and brittle in the wrong hands. He drew musicians and goldsmiths close, dreamed in lines and vaults, and listened to counselors the great lords despised. He made enemies by neglect as much as by design, and misread the steadiness of the ground beneath him. A realm that had accepted the crown's fist bristled at its elegant finger. In 1488, at Sochieburn, a faction of nobles rose, and the king fell, trying to flee or to find sanctuary his body carried from the field. The throne passed to his boy, and poetry in Scotland began, for a time, to prefer a plainer style. James the War stepped into adulthood fast, with a grief that ripened into penance. Tradition says he wore an iron chain under his clothes to remember his father's death. What can be counted are his works. He spoke languages, read widely, and he sailed his own ships. He married Margaret Tudor of England in 1503, welding royal bloodlines into a hinge the island would one day swing on. He sponsored the first press to hum in Edinburgh, paid surgeons and alchemists, and raised a navy to match his ambition, launching the Great Michael, a galleon so vast she strained harbors. He also kept Scotland's old friendship with France, the Auld Alliance, which in one September week became a trap. With Henry VIII campaigning across the Channel, James honored his treaty and marched into Northumberland. At Flodden in 1513, the ground, the weather, and English bills favored the south. The king died fighting, the last monarch of these islands to fall in battle. Around him lay his lords, his bishops, his friends. The court's fine instruments fell silent. Scotland woke the next day a widow, and the new king was a child. James V carried the long echo of Flodden and learned the craft of ruling from regents and their rivalries. As a man, he could be prickly and proud, but he worked. He courted Europe. He married well first to a French princess, then to Mary of Guise, and he built, at Falkland and Linlithgow, the grey bones of castles softened into Renaissance palaces, where light came in framed and the plaster was painted with vines. He founded the College of Justice in 1532, a permanent court that made law less a traveling show and more a habit. He taxed and quarreled and smiled when he wished to, but fortune had a mean humor. In 1542, after a defeat at Solway Moss, sick and spent, he died at Falkland with his heir, an infant daughter. Scotland's future put on a cradle cap. Men frowned at the ceiling and counted what might go wrong. If you listen quietly, you can hear in these rains the same steady undertow. Burghs grew sly and solvent, exporting wool and salted fish, importing books and ideas. Universities at St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen trained clerks who could manage a ledger and a conscience at the same time. The Crown learned to treat paper as a kind of weapon. Charters, statutes, bonds, and summons worked where the spears could not always reach. Castles changed, too. Stirling, Edinburgh, Linlithgow becoming theaters where a king staged not only his safety, but his fitness to sit among European princes. Music and pageantry did their quiet work on men who thought themselves opposed to pageantry. Even in the Highlands, where clan law had its own teeth, royal progress and patronage found purchase. Chiefs liked gifts as much as they liked grudges. But the Stuarts were never allowed to forget the cost of centralization. Each effort to rein in a great lord risked tearing a loyal web somewhere else. Every new tax woke old independence in the glens. The lordship of the Isles had to be broken more than once. The Isles' long memory answering a king's dispatch with the skipper's shrug. Along the border, Reaver surnames obeyed the march wardens when it suited them, and the moon when it didn't. A monarch needed to be part judge, part actor, part drover, and part gambler. The best of the Stuarts were several men at once. The worst were several flaws in one crown, and yet step back, and the pattern shows. From Robert II's quiet inheritance to James V's painted ceilings, royal authority edged outward like light at winter noon. Law anchored more disputes than blood did. Parliament sat longer, and their rolls read thicker. The Church, still whole before the storms to come, lent its scribes and sanctuaries to a government that was learning the rhythm of permanence. Marriage policy, notably James IV's union with Margaret Tudor, stitched Scotland's fate to England's in a way no soldier had ever managed. What looked like romance was architecture. All of this leads, gently and inevitably, toward a threshold the dynasty would cross with a single step. When Mary, Queen of Scots, James Fao's infant, became a woman, her life would knot together love and policy so tightly the cord would burn. Her son, James Essex, would inherit not only his mother's kingdom, but a second one to the south. But that is the next turn of the road. For now, the Stuart story is the story of a crown learning to sit sturdily on a Scottish browse law, made louder than lineage. Palaces made more gracious than garrisons. The nation more present to itself. It did not end feuds, it yoked them. It did not abolish pride, it taught pride to wear a sash that said King's Peace. Out of murders and marriages, statutes and songs, the Stuarts built enough continuity that when history offered a larger stage, Scotland could mount it without staggering. A crown can cross a frontier more quietly than an army. Sometimes it crosses on a horse at dawn. In March 1603, when Elizabeth Ann died childless in her palace at Richmond, the messengers rode north with the news that had long been whispered into sleeves. The nearest heir to England's throne lived in Edinburgh. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, grandson of the Tudor line through Margaret, set his household in order and rode south to become James I of England. He left the high halls of Holyrood for the long road to London, greeted by arches, addresses, and a city that smelled of sea coal and opportunity. It was not an invasion, it was an inheritance. Two kingdoms that had bloodied each other for centuries now shared a single mind under a single hat. Call it what it was and what it was not. It was a union of the crowns, not a union of parliaments or of laws. Scotland kept her own courts and a kirk that did not answer to bishops in copes. England kept her common law and cathedrals. The island did not melt into one substance. It became, instead, a braided rope sturdier in a stress, still made of distinct strands. James, ever fond of a neat image, dreamed openly of a Great Britain. He ordered coins struck with rose and thistle, greened the heraldry with crossed plants, and in 1606 approved a joint flag for ships, a blended saltire and cross that sailors watched snap and crack over wet decks. Symbols. Yes, but symbols are mirrors, and in them a people can practice seeing themselves. The borders learned a new grammar. For generations, the marches had bred their own weather raids whistling through the stone peel towers, surnames that galloped by night and laid feuds by daylight when it suited them. Now the king of the north was also lord of the south. The river country was renamed the Middle Shires. Garrisons were resorted. The old permissions to steal under custom and color were revoked. Some towers quietly lost their ladders. A few gallows gained tenants. Above all, the habit of peace began to take root, where the habit of reprisal once grew like thistle. Traders found they could keep ledgers that planned beyond a harvest. To the west and north, the change was gentler. The lordship of the Isles was already folded, however restively, into the crown. Orkney and Shetland had long since been drawn from the Norse orbit into Scottish law. What the Union of Kings provided was emphasis. Crown officers now could write letters across the island and expect an answer under the same royal sign. Universities hummed the same season on both sides of the Tweed. Presses answered presses. Ministers argued across pulpits with opponents they would never meet. The corridors of Edinburgh had always opened on Europe. Now they also opened on Whitehall. But if roads smoothed, consciences bristled. The Scottish Kirk had undergone its reformation in a different key and tempo from England's the Geneva Psalter learned by heart. Presbyteries in place of sees, a deep suspicion of episcopal sleeves. James, who as a young king had learned how fragile a monarch looks in the hands of angry nobles, admired churches that mirrored his own hierarchy. He tried, with tact and then with firmness, to trim the Scottish settlement toward bishops. It was a careful hand placed on a living branch, and the branch remembered the cut. The old tensions of custom against ordinance, of the king's peace against local pride, now took on a theological timbre. A century that had begun with a bridle of crowns would grow quarrelsome over the fit of vestments, the wording of prayers, the reach of a scepter into a pulpit, the future bishops' wars, covenants signed in cold kirks. A king's neck on a block in a foreign city waited beyond the last page of our medieval tale. But if you press your ear to the close of James's first years, you can hear the far irregular drum. Still, the day by day looked different in kinder ways. Merchants in Leith calculated risks differently when English ports no longer smelled entirely of enemy. Scholars in St. Andrews wrote to counterparts in Oxford and Cambridge without the old snarl of suspicion. On the border, tenants measured plough gates by yield and no longer by how fast they could be driven away from an approaching blaze. The King's Sheriffs found that a warrant issued in London could find through stairs in Edinburgh because the same hand signed both. And when court masques were planned, Scottish musicians and craftsmen told English colleagues how winter light fits a hall and how a banner must be weighted if a door is apt to slam. James himself loved pageantry and words. He walked into Westminster Abbey to be crowned in a chair built to enclose the stone Edward had carried off from Scone 3 centuries earlier. A Scottish king sat above Scotland's old symbol in the shrine of England's monarchy. The history of 2 realms compressed under the weight of a single man. He liked the balance of it. He liked 2. The idea of order from hunting laws to the learned sermons he expected, and he persuaded with bonhomie when he could. He had, after a childhood of conspiracies and iron smiles, a deep faith in patient talk. Sometimes he mistook patience for solution. And what of Scotland's sense of herself, that bone-deep awareness grown from hill shadow and long memory? It did not vanish at a royal signature. Scots continued to argue in their own courts, confess in their own churches, and tax themselves at the insistence of their own estates. The language of law remained Scots. The cadences of the pulpit remained sharp and lean. If anything, the sharing of a king made many cling harder to what felt native. A burgess who had taken pride first in his burgh and then in his realm now took conscious pride in both, lest the southern brightness bleach the colors. And in the Highlands, where loyalty still braided kin and land, a king in London remained a distant picture. Chiefs judged whether royal favor could balance old obligations. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. The medieval story ends not with an act of union that would come later, argued and signed by other hands, but with a bridge. From the dawn fires of clans around Crannogs, from the long patience of Stone at Stirling and Edinburgh, from the steep learning of Alba's first kings and the long grief of Flodden, Scotland walked onto that bridge carrying more than scars. She carried crafts and laws, songs and a stubbornness, the habit of saying no to whatever would flatten her into something simpler than herself. A crown shared could not unteach that word. If you step back and look at the whole skein we have unrolled, you can see the threads that never quite break. The Celts who measured wealth in cattle and cousins, the Picts carving secrecy into a stone, the monks on Iona copying a light that did not gutter in sea winds, the longships that taught the coast to watch the horizon, Kenneth building a name from 2 peoples, the early Alba kings steering between tempest and reef, castles throwing long shadows, then softening into palaces, Macbeth real, not rumored proving that the steadiness can outlive slander, Wallace's bridge and Bruce's marsh and the hedgehog ranks at Bannockburn, the Stuarts turning household office into dynasty, turning statute into habit, Mary's courage and missteps, James riding south beneath a flag not yet quite invented. You can also hear the echoes, Hadrian's soldiers shivering at their wall, border riders whistling between towers, a choir in Stirling testing a new anthem, a farmer thanking the weather for once, a mason tapping a block until it sings level. History is not a ladder, it is a shore. Tides rise and fall, ships come, linger, go, and sometimes leave pieces of themselves behind in a harbor. Scotland's medieval centuries were exactly that, a tide that brought new words, new dangers, new ways to bind a land into a country. The people who had stood barefoot in peat or booted on palace floors did not think in centuries. They thought in lambings, levies, letters of protection, and yet their ordinary courage made a shape that outlasted their names. So let us end where we began, with mist lifting off a ridge and a path that knows your foot. The castles will still be there tomorrow, and the stones will be warm where the sun leaned on them. If tonight's walking has soothed you, let the quiet hold. Scotland will keep watch. She always has,